Almost 1 million people have been trafficked across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe in 2015 alone, while an estimated 25,000 people have disappeared or died in the last decade after their vessels sank somewhere between Africa and Europe. As EU nations struggle to cope with a historic wave of migration via perilous land and sea routes, the ruthless trafficking of human cargo across the Mediterranean risks turning these crystalline waters, once the playground for the rich and famous, into a cemetery at sea. Lampedusa, the southernmost point of Europe, just 70 kilometers from the shores of Africa. Kos, one of the Greek islands, just 5 kilometers from Turkey. Lesbos, even closer to Turkey. These beautiful, barren islands in the Mediterranean Sea are like life rafts for hundreds of thousands of men, women and children caught up in an epic human migration.
My experience in this sector brings me to say that surely we need a collaboration of all European nations, because we find ourselves in front of a phenomenon that is of biblical proportions.
Some of them were trafficked, some of them were very mistreated along the way. They've told us of being beaten by traffickers for asking for water, of seeing others who didn't make the journey, who died on the way.
In 10 years, 20 years, when they write the history of this period we are living, they will say we are responsible for a genocide.
The refugee tragedy and trafficking that began in the Strait of Sicily has spread eastward across the southern Mediterranean, as desperate millions flee conflict and violence in the Middle East, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Each asylum seeker has a unique story, but nearly all have the same goal.
I had to find a way to save my life. So I have to save my dear life.
We take a risk to reach, to the safe life.
I come to Syria and to Turkey to save my life and my family life, my children's life.
We just hope for a safe life.
They make dangerous crossings in flimsy boats from Tunisia, Egypt, Libya and Turkey, landing during the night or at dawn, exhausted but overjoyed to have reached the European Union. The mass migration across the Mediterranean in the years since the Arab Spring in 2011 has presented Europe with a moral and political dilemma that threatens to tear the Union apart. Deep rifts have emerged between nations about how to manage the wave of arrivals, and there is no agreement on common asylum policy. Some are building walls to keep people out. Others are building camps to keep people in. One of the founding principles of the EU, free movement between borders, has been repeatedly violated by the closing of frontiers. Where did it all start? The Mediterranean was a flashpoint for migration even back in the 1990s, after the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, when ships carrying thousands of Albanians fleeing economic and social unrest pulled into Italy's eastern ports. Then, in the early 2000s, migrant boats began arriving on the shores of Sicily. Here at Donna Lucata, a dozen migrants drowned in a 2003 wreck that shocked the small community. The victims lie in unmarked graves in the peaceful Sicilian cemetery of Scicli. The tragedy was repeated again in 2005 and again in 2009. They were rare landings at the time, but only a glimpse of what was yet to come after the world radically changed in 2011. The world watched as the Arab Spring began in Tunisia in February 2011, and was followed by unrest in Egypt and Syria. Then, in September 2011, a bloody civil war erupted in Libya, NATO air power toppling Muammar Gaddafi. Instability across North Africa triggered a flood of landings. Lampedusa was on the front lines of an emergency that would spread across the entire Mediterranean basin. March 2011. Boatloads of people began arriving in rickety fishing vessels from Tunisia. Within weeks, the population of migrants had surpassed the number of inhabitants on the island. Giacomo had just started Radio Delta, the island's only radio station.
Live from the studios of Radio Delta, good morning to all of you radio listeners, or Sha.
Nel 2011 Lampedusa si è ritrovata
In 2011, Lampedusa found itself hosting 10 to 11,000 migrants, and they were here for 45 days, camped out everywhere.
gente accalcata dappertutto.
There was even a place that was named the Hill of Shame, which is just over there, just beyond the port. And we found ourselves witness to a terrifying scenario, as these people didn't even have toilets or a place for their personal hygiene.
They were living in the streets, living on the beaches, living on the famous Hill of Shame by the ports. They were living in whatever they could find. Overturned boats, boxes. I remember in the period, which was around March, it was one of the coldest years in the history of Lampedusa. They suffered a lot.
The locals on Lampedusa generously opened their homes to help.
There were people cooking at midday and in the evening. The centre was overflowing, and they brought the meals to where they were living, to the beaches, to the maritime station. But they were simply too many.
Sulle spiagge, all'area marina protetta, alla stazione marittima dove sono stati in parte, diciamo, ospitati, ma erano troppi.
But the tiny 30 square kilometre island of Lampedusa, with its 6,000 inhabitants, simply couldn't cope. Tensions boiled over, with migrants setting fire to the overcrowded reception centre. Those who worked inside the camp at the time had survived a previous arson attack 2 years before.
It was pure madness. The fire started, and you couldn't see anything because there was black smoke coming out everywhere. And we saw these flames getting higher and higher in a terrifying way. The air had become unbreathable, so we all started running out, and we got out intoxicated by the smoke and fumes, but we made it. Then, in 2011, there was another one.
Camp conditions in Lampedusa were harsh, with months to wait in overcrowded facilities and no means of releasing the growing tensions as migrants demanded the right to move on.
Surely these people, who were closed in there for 3 months without even a television, and their only outlet was a soccer ball, these people eventually lost it. It was like living in an episode of Big Brother, exactly like that.
The government was finally forced to respond and sent ferries to take some people off the island. This was just a first wave of migration across the southern central Mediterranean and was to be followed by tragedies and tensions of increasing magnitude. Over the 4 years since the Arab Spring mass arrivals, new routes have developed via Greece and the Balkans. After the fatigue of hundreds of kilometers of travel, followed by the terror of a sea crossing, comes the frustration of confusing European bureaucracy. The chaos and waiting that migrants endure once they arrive in Europe created flashpoints across the Mediterranean.
till now, there is no solution for Syrians. They said, we are sorry, Syrians have to wait,
While Syrians fleeing civil war are often allowed to move on quickly, Africans and South Asians can languish for years as the bureaucracy runs its course.
For me now, I spent 1 year, 4 months.
When you have to wait for 1 year.
Je sais pas, je sais rien. On m'a rien dit. Si tu as un problème, viens m'expliquer. Vous avez quel problème, Les capitaines sont partis, nous on a assis.
Emiliano Abramo offers support to migrants in the Sicilian reception centres through the Sant'Egidio Catholic charity.
These long waits, a year and a half, sometimes 2 years, bring a migrant to suffer this situation a lot. They aren't able to explain what an asylum request is, that they are in a reception center and cannot work, that they did not become rich like maybe the family believes they did. So often, even these ties are broken.
They lived a tragedy before even arriving at the ports of Palermo or other Sicilian cities. And then they have to wait years, a year and a half, just to have the right to stay in Europe.
Per avere finalmente riconosciuto il diritto a stare in Europa.
Only some of the migrants are allowed to stay in Europe. Some are expatriated. Some escape, or worse.
If the asylum request is positive, they start a new story. But if the request is negative, it is truly a drama. A drama to the point that last month, a 29-year-old Pakistani hung himself when he found out that the outcome of his request was negative and his trip had been meaningless.
In 2013, Pope Francis visited Lampedusa to show solidarity to the island and refugees seeking safe haven there. But sadly, his pleas for a solution fell on deaf ears in Europe. Only a few months later, a tragedy struck that would change the migrant flow drastically. The boat people come during the summer months, with the calm seas. Until 2014, their target was the tiny Italian island of Lampedusa, which lies only 113 kilometers from North Africa. This white, sandy beach was declared the most beautiful in the world shortly before, just a few meters away, a migrant boat capsized. 366 men, women and children drowned.
Noi eravamo in giro con degli amici.
We were hanging out with friends. We heard about this huge mess that had happened, this huge apocalypse. So we all went down to the Rabbit Island beach, because we had heard it happened near there. There was a lot of action there, helicopters overhead and rescue boats everywhere. You can only imagine how the people were feeling.
A boat of 3 Lampedusan fishermen first came to the rescue.
I
looked through the binoculars and see all these people in the sea. You could see only heads. When we got there, it was a tragedy. All these people in the sea, screaming, yelling help. We started picking up people who were in the sea. It was hard work, because they were greasy from the fuel oil. They slipped. Picking up a person who was dying, it's a heavy burden.
La notizia si è divulgata in pochissimo tempo.
The news spread very fast. The islanders were shocked, and all the people came down to the port and the beaches. It was hard. Some we helped with ropes, some we helped with ladders. There was a girl. She was 1.90 meters, very robust. I had to put her on the stern, tie a rope around her, and pull her up with a rope, because who could have lifted that girl? She was rocking back and forth from head to foot. She was near death, exhausted to the point of not being able to go on. We pulled 18 people out, including 2 who were already dead, unfortunately. We could do no more than that.
By the time the Coast Guard arrived, there was little that could be done. The wooden fishing vessel with 366 aboard had sunk to 20 meters under the sea, with its tragic cargo of desperation. In the days that followed, police, Coast Guard and Fire Brigade divers recovered the bodies. Dr. Pietro Bartolo is the only coroner on the island and examined every single body to establish cause of death.
On the stern of the fishing boat, there were 4 dead bodies. Of those, 3 were for sure dead because they were in rigor mortis, and then there was this young girl who was spread out on the net on the stern, and I took her pulse and thought I felt a faint heartbeat. I listened again, and in fact I could hear a heartbeat. She was alive, so we rushed her in the ambulance and resuscitated her for more than an hour, and finally she recovered. It was just saving one, a small thing, but still, it was a great thing that gave us enormous satisfaction.
Hundreds of others were not so lucky. Coast Guard boats came in hour after hour with bodies.
Poi invece abbiamo assistito a...
Then we had to manage a continuous arrival of body after body after body. Among the dead of this tragedy, there were many children. There were pregnant women. The anger? The anger was that this happened on a day when there was beautiful weather and just a few hundred meters from the port. They had arrived. It would have taken just a few more minutes and they would have been safe. In fact, they had already prepared all the children. They were all dressed up. And doing the inspection, I noticed this thing. Because they were about to land somewhere new, so they were all dressed up in a dignified way. And that really struck me, to see all these little children, all with their best clothes on. Well, it really hurt me.
Una cosa che mi ha fatto tanto male.
All the bodies remained there until they were loaded onto the ships and taken to Agrigento, where they finally had their dignified burial.
In the new cemetery of Agrigento, as in dozens of other cemeteries scattered across Sicily, the unnamed migrants are buried as numbers. The government decided to take action. The then Prime Minister, Enrico Letta, ordered the Coast Guard and the Navy to send out patrols deep into international waters close to Libya to intercept the boats. The operation was called Mare Nostrum. It saved lives, but now the traffickers could save money on fuel, knowing that the Italian government would pay for the migrants' onward journey. Palermo. Here in the bustling heart of the gritty Sicilian capital, Italian prosecutor Maurizio Scalia opened an investigation into the Lampedusa disaster.
We began a series of activity with wiretaps, using telephone numbers of these subjects.
The Palermo prosecutor's office became the hub of an Italy-wide investigation into the network of smugglers trafficking migrants across the Mediterranean and onwards towards the north.
We heard live the organizer of this trip, where 366 people died, who in some way confessed during the course of a conversation with another trafficker to have organized that trip. From there, bit by bit, we exposed this network of traffickers. In Libya, we identified the 2 biggest traffickers, and we even managed to get an arrest warrant from the judge. But evidently the political situation in Libya is very unstable, so we were not able to carry out the arrests.
Poco stabile e quindi non siamo riusciti ad eseguire queste misure cautelari.
As investigators found out the hard way, exposing the network is one thing, destroying it is another. But who are the migrants and where do they come from? Why do they leave? Most are fleeing violence, terrorism, religious conflict and war.
Unfortunately, the rebellion there, I decided to leave Casamas because I cannot go back to Gambia. So I decided to take this journey.
They are fighting in Nigeria also to ask me to do what is not under my religion because I'm a Christian. I have a problem because my father is a politician and he got himself into one mess or the other because of politics. So my family, generally, no one is at home now and my father is dead because of the same issue.
La population voulait manifester, eh bien, ils ont arrêté la population de ne pas à se manifester. Et ces jours-là, ils ont commencé porte à porte, ils ont fait, il y avait des morts et plusieurs blessures. Et ils m'ont poursuivi, ils m'ont même tiré, j'ai su le balle. Ouais.
The wars in Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq have displaced millions, mostly to Lebanon and Turkey. More than 700,000 people have taken to the narrow straits that separate Turkey from Greece. They then continue up the Balkan route toward northern Europe.
Go to market, you're afraid. Somebody will come take the boat and you enter inside the people and bomb it and kill the people. Small girl, small boy, women, anything, men for shops. What do? This kill and this kill.
We fled, from the war. Assad's barrels and ISIS knives, terrorists.
You don't have a choice when you go to the army. You have two choices. You have to choose one of them. You don't have any third option. You have to kill or to be killed.
Others are fleeing famine and abject poverty. Abdul Lahab was kidnapped from Abidjan and sent to work in the mines of Mauritania, where his civil rights were denied for one simple reason.
Je suis parti, je suis venu à la police. Il dit non, parce que j'ai un problème, comme ça. Il m'a dit quoi, le policier, le commissaire, il m'a dit quoi, parce que tu es noir.
From there, he moved on to Mali, Niger, Libya. The sub-Saharan migrants are trafficked from one heartless smuggler to another, all the way up through Africa, including a dangerous journey through the Sahara Desert.
Almost 4 to 5 days I'm in the desert before I reach Libya. So it was really a horrible journey, without no food, without no water. What I see in the desert, I don't think I will ever show that in my life again. Definitely. So many people died, so many people lost their life.
Well, our car was robbed by the rebels in the desert, and at the end, by God's grace, I was the only one that succeeded. The rest actually was saved later and returned back to Niger.
The trip is very long for migrants, because from the country of origin to arrive at the Great Funnel, which is Libya, the location where a lot of migrants arrive to await their turn for the trip to Europe, every time there is a passage from one human trafficker to another, they are exploited.
Then he told me that when we reach in Libya, then I have to walk. If I'm walking, I will be walking under him until that money is completed. So I agree with him. Then he take me off with his group people to Libya.
Those who survive the Sahara are often imprisoned the moment they cross into Libya.
I have no document. I was arrested by Libya soldiers.
While I was going to Tripoli, I was caught by the soldier and taken to prison.
They take me to prison.
J'ai montré mon passeport parce qu'il y a pris papier de Mauritanie déjà. J'ai montré mon passeport. Mais pourquoi il m'a caché pour rentrer? Non, je n'ai pas main. D'accord. Vous êtes comme 35 personnes. D'accord. On va en prison.
The police usually ask for a document, And if you don't have a document, you go to prison. If you have a document, they ask for a stamp. And if you have a stamp, they rip out the page. And you go to prison anyway.
Gadron, that's where I arrived. But when we arrived there, we went to prison straight.
Then on our way to Tripoli, we got the soldiers on the checking point. Then they arrest us, ask us for documents. Then we say that we don't have anything. Then they take us from there to prison.
It is the same story for most Africans, who once in Libya are imprisoned and then requisitioned by powerful locals to work as slaves.
They cross kilometre after kilometre, impervious zones of the desert. They arrive finally in Libya, where for weeks and months they are subject to violence and harassment.
What they ask from people is money. Then me, I have no one who to pay for that money for me. So in that prison, because I was among the youngest, what I have to do is to clean the environment. I'll be there cleaning the environment, doing nonsense rubbish works there. I have to do it.
I stayed there for 3 months in the prison. Then I was helped by one soldier. He said he have lawaju. If he rescue me out of the prison, I will work for him. Then he will do my Libya document for me. With the work, I will be working for him.
They needed me to do so many electrical work in that prison yard. I did it and they promised they will leave me.
And so you become a slave. Often they are penned in with fences, like cattle.
On m'a pris à le mettre dans un campement. Il y a 1500 personnes dedans. 1500 personnes, on peut nous tous enfermer dans la chambre, ça ne paie pas. Après, on a fait 6 mois, comme ça.
You'll be in torture, harassment, no food, or even if you have to eat, it will be once per day. So it's crazy.
Il y a 2 mois, on a fait prison. Par jour, on mange un peu. Et l'eau, il y a sel dedans. On boit ça. Même, il y a les gens qui sont venus ensemble, sont malades à cause de l'eau là.
Even for the lucky ones who break out or work their way out from prison, Libya is lawless. No one is safe.
In Libya, everybody is carrying gun. You don't know who is soldier, you don't know who is individual man, you don't know who is civilian, you know. In Libya, they are all the same.
He tried to confront them, but they are with guns. They decided to shoot him. Yes, yes. So it was like crazy. So, yes. And the brother, so unfortunately, he dies there.
They are pushed out on rickety boats or rubber dinghies from the coasts of Egypt, Turkey, Libya.
They are put out on boats and sent to die in the Mediterranean or try to reach Europe.
For many, it is the first time they have ever seen the sea, and there is no turning back.
What they told us already was that we are going to board ship. At the end, in the night when they took us to where we were pushed, we saw a different thing altogether. I haven't seen the sea, not on the sea. I haven't seen it with my eyes. Then he's saying that the journey to Italy is a few hours to some minutes to journey. But there is no going back because once you get to there, to the seashore, they don't allow you to go away. They don't allow you to go back. They don't allow you to change your mind. You must enter. So we had to risk it.
Entre la mort, si ça pèse, le vent ça sort, on va mourir dans l'eau. Comme j'ai dit ça, il m'a tendu, il m'a giflé.
2 people died in our own. We have already seen the rescuers. They threw a rope to us for us to hold it. But everybody wanted to save himself at a particular time. At the same time, you know, they fell into sea and the water took them away.
Sub-Saharan Africans make up the poorest segment of clientele for the traffickers, who often use them as ballast below deck.
I opened the hold and went down and was walking on the dead. There were 25 corpses that had been closed in the hold just as ballast. In fact, some of them were beaten with sticks, and during the inspections of the bodies I found broken bones and head wounds. So they closed them down there, and they died there in a matter of minutes.
The poorest black Africans, who are used as ballast on larger boats, often die from suffocation due to engine fumes, or drown if the ship goes down. But on the top decks, traffickers pack the boat with higher-paying passengers who have already paid for the trip.
I sistemi di pagamento sono assolutamente primordiali, basati sulla fiducia.
The payment systems are absolutely primordial, based on trust, known as the Havala method. And in fact, we can't get to the organization from a financial way. It is a patrimony that has a minimum risk for their investment. If there is a shipwreck, in any case, the money has already been deposited.
Un naufragio, ormai il denaro è stato incassato.
Each leg of the journey has a price.
700 dinars.
1,300.
$1,000.
2,000, 1,000 euro, and come by pont to coast.
Abbiamo accertato che
we determined that the trip from Eritrea to Libya is approximately $5,000.
Successivamente il viaggio dalla Libia.
The trip from Libya to Italy is approximately 1,500 per migrant.
Migrante, e poi le successive tappe dal.
And the successive steps from Sicily to the center of Italy and toward North Europe costs approximately 2,000 euros.
Circa 2.000 euro.
لا في هو أنا مدام وأنا بس هو في 500 دينار.
This Pakistani family paid 5,000 dinars for all of them to travel to Italy in 2015. And although the boat was rickety and the waves high, travelled on top.
هو مش فاهم ولا هو قال لي هذا أنا في سفينة هيك بس هو ممكن نوم ممكن هيك بس.
His wife was pregnant at the time of the crossing, and their young baby was born in the Mineo camp. This former NATO Air Force base is the largest reception centre in Europe.
ثلاثة بابينو هذا بابينو مدام فكر كبير أنا واجد.
But they are among the lucky ones. On the 18th of April 2015, a similar boat carrying 700 people capsized when it came in sight of a tanker that tried to rescue it. Sicilian fishermen from the port town of Mazara del Vallo were in the area and were the first to arrive on the scene.
There
was everything there in the sea: clothing, objects, children's shoes even. But other than all the floating debris, we found nothing else. Just these 4 bodies, and that's it.
Altri corpi non ne hanno trovati, hanno trovato solo questi primi 4 e poi basta.
Hundreds drowned, but the boat captain was identified by the few who survived the traumatic incident after they were brought to the port of Catania.
In genere sono gli stessi immigrati.
In general, it is usually the migrants themselves who indicate to the police who are the ones who were the captains of the boats, who are responsible for terrible crimes in the Sea of Lampedusa. For example, they throw in the sea those who protest, who are sick, the women who yell, or the children who cry.
Chi protesta perché è ammalato, le donne che gridano, I bambini che piangono.
These seem like stories we hear from the concentration camps of Dachau and Auschwitz.
Tensions with Libya are high, making any attempt to arrest traffickers impossible. The fishing community of Mazara del Vallo is one of the largest in the Mediterranean, and the boats fish in international waters off the Libyan coast, where their nets get caught on sunken vessels and they risk being targeted by Libyan gangsters. Domenico has lost one of his ships to Libyan militias, but luckily was able to save the crew.
A noi sono venuti con un battello, con un piccolo battello.
They came with a small boat full of machine guns and hand grenades. They sequestered us and brought us to the port of Benghazi. And after a month, after various negotiations, we left from there with a boatload of money, and we had to pay these militias, because otherwise they would not let us go.
Perché se no non ci facevano uscire da lì.
Ultimamente c'è stato il fenomeno dell'uso della forza anche delle...
Recently, there was the phenomenon of the use of arms to recover the boat. After the Coast Guard ships have rescued the migrants, they get close to the traffickers' boats, shoot against our boats, and try to recover the dinghy.
Con dei barconi trafficanti sparano verso le nostre imbarcazioni e cercano di recuperare l'imbarcazione, il gommone.
The mobilization of European fleets now patrolling the waters off Libya will make it more difficult for the traffickers, who have been making huge profits for years. But perhaps the only way to effectively disrupt this lucrative market is to offer safe and low-cost passage, a humanitarian bridge. The Mediterranean Sea covers some 2.5 million square kilometers from Spain to Israel. Nearly 1 million people crossed it by boat in 2015 to reach the shores of Europe, mainly via Italy and Greece. They transit through Turkey, Egypt, Libya, sometimes paying multiple smugglers along the way. Some are pushed directly out to sea. Others are taken to mother ships before being offloaded onto smaller boats near European waters. The crisis began with refugee and migrant arrivals in Italy. But where to next? Once on Italian shores, many choose to leave the reception centres and continue through Europe clandestinely. This is especially true of Eritreans, who make up 18% of the migrants.
Sono persone di passaggio.
These are people passing through, the so-called invisibles, people who escape from the centers, pass by us to get something to eat, and then come together to take a bus either to Rome or Milan before leaving Italy. Their objective is to reach other family members in Northern Europe.
Diciamo che il loro obiettivo è quello di raggiungere i propri familiari nel nord Europa.
They continue north by bus, truck or train toward the Alps. Here in the fashion capital of Milan, they rest in the empty glass storefront designed for window shopping in the train station. They often rely on help from volunteers. But in the spring of 2015, the refugee crisis shifted eastwards, with nearly 2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey and another million in Lebanon beginning to migrate toward Europe via Greece and the Balkans. These are the narrow straits that separate Turkey from Greece. Just a few kilometers. With a night of fine weather, the crossing is easy.
It's simple, like everybody else. We get on the boat, we took the direction and we started the engine. That's all. It's simple.
Every day, dozens of such boats land on the shores of the Greek islands close to Turkey. Here, on Lesbos, new arrivals strip off their soggy life jackets and then must walk 70 kilometers to this crowded reception center, where they must wait to be registered and wait some more before being allowed to leave for Athens. In the most crowded periods, migrants resorted to sleeping rough and sought shelter in the makeshift tent cities throughout the port. Accidents can be deadly, though, even in these benign waters. This image of a Turkish soldier carrying 2-year-old Elan Kurdi on this tourist beach near Bodrum shocked the world. Since then, dozens have drowned in these same waters. This is the remote Turkish beach on the Akiarlar Peninsula where the boats leave from. Signs of recent activity are everywhere. During the day, men climb the mountainous promontory to prepare boats for the evening's activity. When the sun goes down on Bodrum, desperate refugees make their way up the dark, thorny paths here to the takeoff point. Jamal was a Sunni, an officer in the Iraqi army who had to flee.
I work in the army Iraq, officer in the army Iraq, and that's danger for me to stay in Iraq because the militia is kill any person he work in the army. In less time, he kill him.
This is the beach where Jamal's children took a small boat on the night of September the 2nd, 2015, hoping to make the trip from Bodrum to Kos in an hour.
When he come to go by boat, this boat is small. Maybe he for 10 person, but he brought with him 17 person in this boat. After they come, before they receive to Kos, he have accident during in the sea. Some people dead, some people swimming to another side, to Turkish side, and some people is lost. 3 people lost. My children with 2 children, he lost. He don't found anything in Turkey.
Others were more fortunate, like these Syrians and Iraqis who had just landed at dawn on the 18th of September 2015.
We see all the water is on the boat, and we all the people we thinking we will be die. Just I want from the God to save all these people who came from Turkish. We want to be in a place safe. This is all we need.
For those who do make it, the welcome on Kos is quite different from the reception they receive in Italy. This group has just been rescued by an Italian finance police vessel in the straits between Bodrum and Kos. They use their life jackets as mattresses and wash where they can. They are given no official information, but simply told to go to the Frontex office to be identified.
First, you have to go to the Red Cross and take a ticket with number after a verification of your names, okay, your documents, passports or identity or something like that, okay, and after that you will take the number. Then you go to the police. You will find them on the list of the police.
Although these islands are part of the European Union, the fingerprinting is not recognized by the rest of Europe, and Greece refuses to give them refugee status. In Italy as well, migrants often will do anything to avoid being fingerprinted.
The fact is, the adults, as well as the minors who come to us, they are escaping from the centers. They don't want the police to take their fingerprints, because they don't want that the bureaucratic process of the asylum request is started in Italy.
It is an unspoken understanding in the southern Mediterranean. Greece and Italy don't want them, and most don't want to stay in Greece or Italy.
If there is opportunity, in Italy I stay. If there is no opportunity, I find my way out.
I think we will go to Germany.
I would like to go to Austria, or stay in Austria, or go to Finland or Sweden, any place.
My children, when I lost him, he want to go to Germany to play football because he plays football.
International volunteers have arrived on Greek and Italian islands to try to help. One group, MOAS, even chartered their own rescue yacht and staffed it with Médecins Sans Frontières. But the sheer scale of the crisis is overwhelming.
We start in the morning with breakfast. We take care of personal hygiene issues, and then do the distribution of clothes, which we collect from private citizens.
Well, in the morning then we go along the coastline and give them like dry clothes, some water, some like food, because they are hungry and thirsty. And then at 11:30 we go to the police station, and most of the men are waiting there to register themselves. And we give some water and a fruit, like an apple or an orange.
Migrants from Africa sometimes arrive barefoot, then are checked for scabies and infectious diseases at the Italian ports where they arrived. On Kos and Lesbos, these Syrian and Iraqi families arrived well-dressed and ready to continue their voyage north. But in both Italy and Greece, new arrivals are supposed to receive authorization and their paperwork before moving on. On Kos, the names of the fortunate few who have been authorized appear on a list that is posted on this board every morning, which the refugees examine attentively, searching for their names. The queues in front of the police station are long, and tempers flare as conditions are harsh. Abandoned hotels often become a home from home for migrants seeking shelter. On Kos, they flocked to the Captain Elias on the outskirts of town. When local authorities closed it due to squalid conditions, migrants were forced out onto the streets. They began living in tents near the police station and in the park until their papers were ready. The park became known as the jungle.
Then they went to a park known as the jungle. That is where they live, mostly sleeping on the ground or sometimes on cardboard boxes. And the Syrian families, when they arrive, they often get rooms in the hotels, usually for 15 euros a night.
And it is this way that pristine beachfront destinations across the Mediterranean, once reserved for wealthy tourists, have become the starting point of the most desperate, epic migration crisis Europe has undergone since World War II. When the vital paperwork comes through at last, refugees can move on to the next phase of their long march.
About 24 hours to Macedonia, then maybe 7 to 10 hours to Serbia. Then we get the Hungarian borders, the most difficult border. And there is the problem and the hardest part of the journey.
While Syrians are financially better off and can find places on the ferries that carry refugees to the continent, the drama of less fortunate migrants often leaves them vulnerable. This young man traveled on foot and by bus from Pakistan to Istanbul.
100 Pakistan. In road, sleeping.
He paid $1,000 to go to Greece, but was told by smugglers he could not continue because priority was being given to Syrians.
You are not coming to Akialar. Ne, you are Pakistani. Ne, Pakistani yoke. Pakistani money where you send yoke.
Now he's out of money and is stuck at the Bodrum bus station. This is his bed. Investigators say a growing concern is that smugglers' networks extend into the heartland of Europe.
In general, when they arrive in Italy, The migrants already have the cell of the trafficker who is going to take care of their trip to Central or North Italy and then into North Europe. They contact them and sometimes have them escape from the reception centers.
Dai centri di accoglienza.
Organized crime is also finding ways to profit from lethal trafficking of human cargo. One infamous mob boss in Rome even boasted that migrants were a more lucrative trade than drugs. The profitable contracts for running reception centers are a low-risk, high-profit business. Children traveling alone are among the most vulnerable. Sometimes they fall prey to prostitution or organ harvesting rings. The lucky ones are taken in by state welfare or charity organizations.
There is certainly a torpid network of trafficking of children's organs who are taken and used by these death merchants and then only later taken on to the second reception, the so-called second reception.
These teenagers have been through so much to be so young. One teenager I spoke to, he talked about just wanting a home, a place that his mother and his brother and he could live. Unfortunately, they were separated. When he left, there was fighting. He had to run for his life. He doesn't know if his mother and his brother are alive. But we just spoke and he talked about craving that, of having a home that they could live in together. Others want to rejoin their family, to just be able to call them, to have a settled life. It's a very basic set of needs that people want because they've been away from home. You have to keep in mind it's not just weeks. In some cases it's months, it's maybe 2 years.
Abbiamo avuto diversi minori.
We had various minors who asked us for first aid or sanitary help because they had scabies or dermatological problems. We offered to take them to the hospital, but they refused because they don't want to be identified.
Loro si sono rifiutati per paura di essere identificati.
The families who are fleeing Syria have seen incredible amounts of violence. The children who lived in Syria have seen people shot, have seen, often been the victims of violence directly themselves. So as that conflict has gone on for more than 4 years, you see that people have been through these very traumatic experiences, even young children, the pictures they draw. It shows what's pushing them out of Syria into neighboring countries, but also to make such a long journey.
Although introducing illegal immigrants into the European Union is a crime, punishable with jail sentences, where there is demand, market forces are insurmountable, making the crisis unlikely to wane until stability is achieved in the countries of origin.
There is no choice, mister. There is no choice. Even if you die, under, barrels, okay, or terrorist attacks, or, cross the sea with its dangers to go to the safe land.
When I go for a walk before 2006 with my brother and my father, some people come in 2 motors and you slay me and my brother. My brother, you take 5 gun, 5 shooter, and me 1. Yeah, but God, you keep me and my brother and remain for life. This is my life in my country.
The men, women and children who leave conflict-torn areas of Africa, Asia and the Middle East for Europe certainly do not risk their lives for purely economic reasons. Everyone has a compelling reason to leave their homeland to find safety elsewhere and risk losing their lives along the way.
When you go to Italy, you have freedom forever. When you die in Libya, you die. When you stay in Libya, no more freedom. Because Libya, today negative, tomorrow positive. When you are here, you might die. When you are here, you might succeed. But when you go to Europe, you will succeed forever. If you succeed in the Mediterranean Sea, you are free forever.
I don't have a choice. Because here, what is important to me is not everything but my dear life. But here, I can tell you that I'm safe. When there is life, there is hope. For today, I'm alive, so I still get hope.
We just want some countries to deal with other options, just to avoid themselves this danger, because nobody cares if you died or not. here is the solution. You can save our lives.
Unless the international community acts soon to provide safe passage for refugees and prevent lethal trafficking of human cargo, thousands more will die, taking their hopes and dreams with them to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Storm clouds gather over the Mediterranean Sea and its dark secrets. Here, along the coasts of Italy, dozens, some say even hundreds of ships carrying a lethal cargo of toxic waste were allegedly sunk during the 1980s and 1990s, while yet more poisonous refuse was dumped in clandestine pits on dry land. The poisoned ships and the secret waste landfills have been the subject of investigation for decades, but institutions in Italy have consistently failed to uncover the true extent of criminal disposal of the unmentionable side effects of Europe's economic boom. Andrea Palladino of Il Fatto Quotidiano, an Italian investigative journalist and researcher, has come to the city of Amantea, Calabria, to visit the site where in 1990 a mysterious ship washed ashore without its crew. The stormy seas on the 14th of December 1990 pushed the roll-on, roll-off cargo ship Rosso onto the beach of Formiciche, just south of Amantea. It was on its way from Malta to La Spezia. In this unique footage, shot by a local police officer, the ship is still at the mercy of the waves. What was aboard the ship when it was abandoned by the crew may never be known, as a conspiracy of silence surrounds the disposal of toxic waste in Italy in the 1980s and 90s, a conspiracy that has claimed at least 2 lives. It is a moral crisis that still affects Italy and the Mediterranean today.
What is important, also out of respect for a journalist colleague who died following this lead, is to demand the truth always and relentlessly with regards to this traffic.
Today, and I have to say this with sadness, we have only repentant informers from within the Camorra. There is not a single industrialist who has admitted to a crime.
If these ships, or even just a few of these ships, actually do contain radioactive material, or dangerous toxic materials as they used to call it, they are ticking time bombs.
From Calabria to Naples, the story of the illegal disposal of toxic waste is one of the darkest pages in the history of Italian and European industrial development. The small Calabrian town on the Tyrrhenian coastline was the scene of one of the most extraordinary shipwrecks of the time. On the 14th of December 1990, the MV Rosso was on the home leg of a journey from Marina di Carrara to Malta and back to La Spezia, when it ran into trouble and began taking on water. The crew was winched off, but 11 hours later it was washed up onto the beach here. The ship had a sinister story.
At the end of 1989, the Jolly Rosso leaves for Beirut in the Lebanon and was going to pick up dangerous waste, Italian waste, produced by Italian industry, that had been brought there a few months previously, a year and a half previously, illegally according to the Lebanese government, and left near Beirut, in a suburb of Beirut.
The salvage company Smith was called in with a tug to try to pull the Rosso off the shore, but this proved impossible. Over the next year, the ship was broken up on the beach by a local company. What the Rosso was carrying and why the crew abandoned it, although not in danger of sinking, has become part of the wider investigation into the clandestine toxic ships.
There is some evidence that the residues from the Rosso, ex-Jolly Rosso, were found in the area of the River Oliva.
Appunto della Rosso, ex Jolly Rosso, trovati nella zona del fiume Oliva.
Another train station, another mystery. Cape Spartivento is where Andrea Palladino has come to meet an old friend, a veteran of the case of the Mediterranean's toxic ships. The inquiry eventually brought here Nuccio Barilla, today Secretary General of the Legambiente conservationist organization. This is where the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas meet, where the sea floor is more than 1,000 meters deep, a perfect place to hide a toxic ship. The ship's name was Regal, and records show it sank on the 21st of September 1987. A cloak of mystery still surrounds it, despite years of investigations set off by an informer of the Legambiente.
Nel 1994 ci imbattemmo in una storia.
In 1994, we came across a story that was strange, weird, unique. And as the National Observatory for Legality and as the Reggio Calabria section of the Legambiente, we presented a complaint to the Prefecture of Reggio Calabria, a small prefecture, on the basis of information we had received.
Presentare un esposto sulla base di notizie di cui eravamo entrati in possesso.
The informer told the activists that the local mafia, the 'Ndrangheta, was carrying toxic waste from ships that docked in Calabria to be hidden in the caves of Aspromonte, the wild mountain range of Calabria. The complex and wide-ranging investigation met with institutional hostility and cover-ups. Still today, the rivers and sea in the area present worrying signs of radioactivity.
What has been established is that this sea has significant contamination of heavy metals and cesium-187, and this has been established in analysis done by Italian environmental agencies.
Far to the north of Italy, journalist Sondra Coggio has battled for decades to shed light on waste trafficking in the La Spezia area, both in the local landfills and in ships sailing from the port.
Calabria is perfect because it had a very deep sea floor with undersea canyons and has natural mineralogical characteristics, such that radars will always identify base radioactivity. This has been explained to me by several sources that, without wishing to name them, spoke to me about it.
Just 20 minutes by car from La Spezia is the port of Marina di Carrara, specialized in loading marble from the most famous marble quarries in the world. Many of the mystery ships left either La Spezia or this port. Marble dust is heavy and known to mask radioactivity.
In quel periodo, per esempio, fu decisivo.
At that time, for example, the contribution of the Forestry Police of Brescia was decisive and extremely important. The Forestry Police of Brescia that was already investigating these ships, and it was thanks to indications by the Forestry Police of Brescia that pointed to one of the ships that occupied us most over the years, the Rigel.
Una delle navi che più hanno impegnato, diciamo, negli anni, la Rigel.
If the Rigel is the earliest documented toxic ship in Calabria, the Rosso raised investigators' suspicions years after it washed up on the Calabrian coast. This incredible footage of the Rosso shows it empty. The remains of a cargo of tobacco is spread around the hold, and much of it has fallen into the sea and washed up on the shoreline. The outside of the ship has been damaged by an attempt by another ship to tow it before it reached the beach.
Another fact that has been proven is that a few kilometers away, on the River Oliva, investigators found industrial waste that was stocked. How can I describe it? Not simply abandoned barrels near a river. No, these were stocked in a reinforced concrete sarcophagus. So, with a method that goes beyond the simple, illegal waste disposal that, unfortunately, is characteristic of southern Italy.
The mystery of the Rosso is emblematic of the story of the toxic ships. There is a wide hole cut in its side to provide access to the hold. The hold seems empty, and yet this film in itself holds an enigma. Only an expert could fully understand the mystery of the toxic ships. One of the key players in the investigation was a Coast Guard captain, Natale De Grazia, who brought his technical knowledge of commercial shipping to the table. He was a close personal friend of Nuccio Barilà.
I knew Natale De Grazia as a youth, in the quarter we lived in the playing fields of Gallico Marina. Then I met him again as a young officer of the Coast Guard. He became our reference in the 1980s for the environmental battles we were fighting.
Andrea Palladino wrote a book about the global aspects of toxic waste disposal with a colleague, Sandro Mattioli, who lives and works in Berlin.
During the research for the book, it quickly revealed that the waste problem was actually not waste being brought to Germany, but rather waste that was being disposed of down to Italy as well as to Africa in the past. So on this theme, my friend and colleague Andrea Palladino and I, we researched for a long time, and this is how the book came about.
The economic boom of the 1970s and 80s led to the growth of production of industrial waste, in quantities and of types that had never been seen before. In Europe, there are no less than 100 nuclear electricity generating plants. In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster showed the risk the world was running with nuclear energy. Then there are the hospitals, which use hundreds of kilos of toxic X-ray material every year, not to mention chemical and petrochemical plants. Stocking or destroying radioactive waste that takes thousands of years to break down was becoming a nightmare for Europe. In the 1980s, the Nuclear Energy Agency developed a research project on the shores of Lake Maggiore, between Italy and Switzerland, to test whether heavy torpedoes, free-falling penetrators, could be literally dropped at high speed into the muddy floor of the world's seas, so deep that they would do no harm to anyone. The project was abandoned in 1987, and in 1993 the solution was officially banned by the London Convention.
Di questo progetto si impossessò un signore.
This project fell into the hands of a certain Giorgio Comerio, who set up a company, the ODM, Oceanic Disposal Management, and together with others who gravitated in the area of waste disposal, with contacts with foreign states and so forth, took the project forward privately.
Eccetera, eccetera, lo portò avanti privatamente.
In May 1995, the Forestry Police, together with Captain De Grazia and the Carabinieri, searched the home of Giorgio Comerio, the entrepreneur whose plan it was to sink radioactive waste in the seabed. They find several items and some diaries that are among the evidence of the inquiry, and in the materials handed over to the Parliamentary Commission. And on the page of the 21st of September 1987, there's a phrase which reads, "Lost the ship." Captain De Grazia notes that from his own research that the only ship to sink on that day was the Rigel.
Personalmente ho partecipato con un gruppo di giovani volonterosi amici, abbiamo deciso di investire tempo e denaro per realizzare un progetto e un'ipotesi di fattibilità ingegneristica.
The Rigel allegedly sank on the 21st of September 1987, off the coast at Cape Spartivento. It was the subject of a court action brought by Britain's insurance brokers Lloyd's, who refused to pay compensation because they suspected the ship had been scuttled. At the time, customs officers in La Spezia, the port it had departed from, had suspected the ship owners of smuggling and had tapped their phones.
Le intercettazioni servirono molto perché
phone taps were useful because they used code words to announce the sinking of the Rigel using code words that became famous. The child is born. He's a boy. This morning at dawn.
Che sono poi rimaste famose, il bimbo è nato, è un maschio, stamani all'alba.
The wiretaps done at the time revealed some dialogue of the crew, at times fairly raw, where they would say, "Oh, this time the cargo is really shit." Sorry for the term, but they used it to say this was not your usual cargo. It was a particular cargo.
Quando I magistrati di Reggio Calabria hanno ricevuto l'informativa da parte del Corpo Forestale.
When the investigators of Reggio Calabria received the information from the Brescia Forestry Police, they found out that the Forestry Police was in touch with a source known as Pinocchio, that the ship was also carrying modified uranium, extremely dangerous radioactive material that alarmed the investigators, and that narrowed the investigation.
Rappresentavano un punto d'allarme per la magistratura. Da lì partì la focalizzazione di una indagine.
Le assicurazioni che avevano coperto.
The insurance company that had covered the cargo charged a private investigation company specialized in naval insurance to verify what had really happened. One of their sources, from Piraeus in Greece, told them that the ship actually hadn't sunk at Capo Spartivento, that it had continued its journey to the Lebanon, reached a small port north of Beirut, and that they could identify the ship and hand it over to the insurance company.
Di individuare la nave consegnandola agli assicuratori.
New research by Andrea Palladino and a colleague, Andrea Tornago, has shown that it is possible that the Rigel actually completed its journey, and the alleged sinking was an elaborate smokescreen so that the waste could not be traced.
Quello che viene raccontato che sostanzialmente era stata ridipinta.
What they are told is that the ship had been repainted, ready to change IMO number, name, and return to the seas. The 21st of September 1987 is the date of arrival in Beirut of the ship Radost that brought Italian waste to Beirut, the waste that would be retrieved by the Jolly Rosso, which is another story. And there's something else. There's an acronym on the page of that diary, which is the acronym of the company that actually carried out the search for the Rigel.
Che avrebbe fatto, diciamo, la ricerca della Rigel.
During the same search, the investigators allegedly also found the death certificate of an Italian journalist murdered in Somalia in 1994. Somalia was one of Italy's client states until the devastating civil war of 1992.
Somalia was certainly the arrival point of Italian waste, so much so that one of the first voyages of one of the first toxic ships, the Lynx, which left Marina di Carrara in 1986, headed for Djibouti, which is a French protectorate next to Somalia, which was probably a cover. This is a supposition, but there are certainly no waste treatment plants in Djibouti, that's for sure.
The Ilaria Alpi case is one that still torments the Italian judicial scene and has been dogged by cover-ups and judicial errors. These pictures of the journalist and her cameraman, Miran Hrovatin, were taken by photojournalist Raffaele Ciriello, later killed in Palestine.
Ilaria Alpi makes her last journey in March 1994, and she leaves for Bozazo. Bozazo is in the north of Somalia, far from the conflict. It wasn't an area of conflict. On the 14th of March, in the afternoon, she arrives in Bozazo port, and there's a key interview with the Sultan of Bozazo, where there's a suggestion, where it becomes clear that Ilaria Alpi is interested in a Somali shipping company, supported by Italian cooperation money, based at that time in Gaeta.
The fishing company Shifco, managed by Omar Said Mounye, a Somali who ran the business from Italy, was later identified by the United Nations as covering an arms smuggling operation. as these documents show. The tape brought back from Somalia shows a strange cut during the interview.
Invece non crede che sarebbe importante che si sapesse che c'è questa...
Beh, durante il collasso lui era a capo di questa flotta, una internazionale che si chiama Shifco. Ed era una proprietà praticamente del Siad Barre. E lui gli faceva l'amministratore.
A few hours later, Ilaria Alpi and her cameraman were shot dead in the streets of Mogadishu. They were violent times, but this seemed more like an execution, said her friends.
There's a story tied to several documents attributable to the Italian secret services that indicate that there was a mission underway by our military intelligence, special services essentially, outside the military intelligence, so groups of special intelligence forces, I don't know what they are officially called, that was being carried out at that time in Bosaso. Obviously, this suggests a particularly worrying context with regards to the death of Ilaria Alpi. What is certain is that when Ilaria Alpi returns to Mogadishu, together with her cameraman, Miram Hrovatin, she is killed in an ambush to all effects, and what is certain, and always happens in these stories, is that the following investigations are dogged by evidence tampering, false leads, and epic failures.
Another mysterious death blocked the investigation into the toxic ships. On the 12th of December 1995, Captain Natale De Grazia and colleagues were on their way up to La Spezia to collect key evidence that could have proved decisive for the investigation, when the Coast Guard officer died of an apparent heart attack.
Molti magistrati erano stati minacciati. Qualcuno pedinato.
The investigators had been threatened. Some of them followed. Strange things were happening around this investigation, so much so that due to the seriousness of the crimes and the international implications, the magistrates felt obliged to inform the President of the Republic, due to the delicate nature of the investigation. They were about to open a complicated can of worms, and De Grazia was a key that opened many doors.
De Grazia era veramente una chiave che apriva tante cose.
Quell'inchiesta poteva avere una svolta.
That investigation could have turned a corner, and that corner was represented by a ship. And this is a story of ships. And it was the Latvia that had once belonged to the Soviet secret services, the KGB, which at a certain point, and this is 1995, there's a source of the group of investigators that were following the toxic ships that told them the ship was about to leave port and that it was going to be used to carry dangerous cargo, probably radioactive.
Probabilmente radioattivi.
Natale De Grazia had turned an unwelcome spotlight on the toxic ships that left from the port of La Spezia, and the Latvia could have been crucial to the investigation. Later, he was found to have been poisoned.
Il problema è che questa nave parte tipo una settimana prima del viaggio di Natale Grazia, senza nessuno sapesse nulla.
The problem is that this ship leaves about a week before Natale De Grazia's journey, without him knowing it. Official documents say that it was towed. By then it was a wreck. It had been burned too. Towed to Turkey. I and other colleagues have written to the yards that should have received this ship, but we never received a reply with regards to what happened to this ship, so there is no certainty about what happened to it. It is the epilogue to an investigation that evolved over the 1990s that involves the death of Natale De Grazia.
Occupò gli anni 90, che si sovrappone appunto alla morte di Natale De Grazia.
Investigators found that the hub of the traffic was La Spezia and the nearby port of Marina di Carrara. La Spezia is an important naval base, and Marina di Carrara serves the most famous marble quarries in the world.
Sometimes there are cargoes that have no sense. Often, for example, there is a cargo of marble granules or residue, or cement blocks, which have such a low economic value that it makes no sense to carry them. So, analysing this data, we find out that there are dozens and dozens of sinkings that are at least suspicious.
The case became bogged down until 2005, when there was a new opening into the dark world of the sunken, toxic ships of the Mediterranean.
Dr. Giordano Bruno of the Paola Prosecutor's Office opened an investigation on the basis of information he received, according to which there is a possible sighting of a wreck a few kilometers out from Amantea, so a place that falls in line with the story, at Cetraro. A cargo ship with a significant name, the Kunski, another name that goes back to Beirut in 1989, because the Kunski was used in the operation to recover the industrial waste from Beirut.
Francesco Fonti, an ex-member of the Calabrian mafia, delivered to the Italian magazine Espresso a 49-page document that names the ships containing toxic waste that he personally sank and their locations. A search by the Coast Guard delivered these pictures, shown on all national and local TV stations. Pictures from over 400 meters depth to the investigator's desk. They seemed to confirm the words of the mafia turncoat.
From the first images, the length, the shape and other information seemed to correspond to what the mafia turncoat, or ex-mafia turncoat, one Francesco Fonti, said. That ship, as filmed in this first underwater search, corresponded to the Kunski.
These waters off the coast of Calabria are among the most beautiful in the Mediterranean. But, according to the Legambiente, they hide the darkest secrets of the 1980s.
Bene, ci fu questo clamore dicendo, ecco, vedete, abbiamo trovato finalmente quello che era sempre mancato in questa storia.
So there is this clamour, because they had found what has always been missing from this investigation, what is generally called the smoking gun. In other words, the proof that the ships were sunk in the Tyrrhenian Sea with dangerous waste, if not radioactive materials, aboard. A private company was sent to carry out a second survey mission, and when they lowered the ROV in October, so just 2 months after the first find, they discovered that the wreck was an old wreck, sunk during a conflict in the early 20th century, the Catania, completely harmless.
Del conflitto dei primi del Novecento, il Catania, assolutamente innocuo.
Analysis of the seawater here shows traces of radioactivity, so much so that fishing was forbidden for months. But the wreck of the Kunski has never been found. However, prosecutor Bruno, who preferred not to be interviewed but confirmed his findings, continued to investigate the Rosso case. Investigators eventually traced the waste that had been removed from the hold to the place it had been dumped.
This is the mouth of the Oliva River, a river that comes down from the mountains behind me, runs down this valley and comes out at a few hundred meters from where the Rosso, the ship Rosso, ran aground. More recently, investigators have found industrial waste, certainly waste that comes from industrial activity that is not to be found within a radius of 200 to 300 kilometers. They were found close to an artificial bank of this river, inside a structure built along the river.
In 2011, a local construction entrepreneur was charged with hiding toxic waste. There was no way of knowing if it came from the Rosso.
Ci sono state, durante le indagini, sono stati riscontrati anche la presenza di...
During the investigation, radioactive isotopes were found to be present, and analysis was carried out to establish to what extent this came from natural radioactivity, and partially it was due to natural radioactivity, and to what extent due to fallout from Chernobyl, to identify the origins of this radioactive contamination. The doubt remains that there is indeed radioactive waste buried here.
Esserci anche, come dire, resti di rifiuti anche radioattivi.
Although the film of the hold of the Rosso shows it empty, the local police officer who made it available later claimed to prosecutors that indeed the waste had been removed and relocated in the bed of the river Oliva. Today, he denies this. The mother of all waste deposits was found far to the north, in the port town of La Spezia.
An investigation carried out not by La Spezia, but from outside by the Asti prosecutor's office, laid bare what everyone already knew. Let's be honest, that here there was an illegal traffic of waste, and waste arrived from outside, not only from the industrialized north of the country, but also from outside the frontiers. In 1995, the Asti prosecutors laid bare this reality and showed that administrators, politicians, professionals, and Navy personnel were corrupt.
Where the excess from these toxic waste dumps went is still a matter of conjecture. The Rosso investigation was closed in 2009, as were many others that involved waste brokers and traffickers of the 1990s, with no convictions. Out of 2,000 documents that are known to mention the trafficking of toxic waste, only 200 have been released. What is sure is that something changed radically in the 1990s with regard to the transport and stocking of toxic waste, which began taking new routes. Over the 1990s, the nature of the traffic changed, with investigations into shipping making sinking toxic ships more and more problematic.
So it's as though there's a passing of the baton, a phase in which the waste is taken abroad using ships, and mainly in Africa in the 1980s, in which a number of ships were sunk with this waste, after which, maybe as a result of international reaction that leads to international conventions such as the Bâle Convention that outlaws the transport of waste, things change, and the same network converts with the disposal and deep burial of waste in the area of Campania.
The mafia turncoat Carmine Schiavone contributed to clearly mapping out the extent of the illegal waste disposal and predicted that in 20 years the inhabitants would all start to suffer from cancer. His deposition in 1997, kept secret till 2013, was a shock to investigators. Italy's National Health Institute confirms that in 2014 there was a 10% higher cancer rate for men and 13% higher for women in the Caserta area, with a 56% higher than average hospitalization of children with cancer.
Carmine Schiavone speaks of the excess waste. He says that they sent trucks up from the south to pick up the excess. He said to me that first they filled up the whole of the north, wherever they could, under the public works, under the motorways, in the quarries, in the mountains. Then he said, here, we've filled everything, after which we began taking it south.
Sagte, sein Clan habe aus Deutschland radioaktive Abfälle nach Italien.
He said the clan had brought the radioactive waste from Germany to Italy, brought it to Campania, to the area around Caserta, where he was from, and it had been dumped there. He said the radioactive waste that came from Germany was in leaden boxes and had the stamp of the eagle on it, and it was mixed with a domestic waste or industrial waste, and then these 15 or 20-meter holes were covered.
Industrieabfall und dazwischen immer wieder Erdschichten, bis dann dieses Loch von 20 Metern Tiefe oder 15 Metern Tiefe, je nachdem, aufgefüllt war.
Here in the hinterland of Naples, the local mafia clan, known as the clan of Casal di Principe, the Casalesi, controlled the public works contracts. The heartland of the Casalesi clan is this unassuming town close to Naples and Caserta. The local mafia's main business was construction and management of public works, and they had access to trucks, diggers, and land. Maurizio Patriciello, parish priest of Caivano, is the leader of the anti-pollution activists.
I met Carmine Schiavone a few years ago, and I asked him this. Now tell us, help us, be on our side. And many of the places he indicated are no longer in the countryside. Now there are buildings on them, and whole parks.
Gianni Caruso is a local activist and has exposed many of the environmental frauds of the past 8 years.
This is a landfill that is about 30 years old. There are at least 12 like this in the Vasto area of Giuliano. The Vassallo, Bidognetti, Micillo, all the personalities of the Camorra that are all on trial today. And we are all civil plaintiffs. This was a legal landfill. They emptied toxic waste, such as the waste from Porto Marghera, the Acne of Cengio, and the industrial waste of Indesit and Acme.
The extreme poverty in the area meant that the local mafia had access to infinite labor in exchange for the basic material necessities.
I have heard with my own ears some of the people say, "Father, the Camorra gives us bread." This is horrible, but true. When a family lives in poverty, doesn't have money to pay for electricity, and the Camorra gives you the means to put bread on the table, this is true. Obviously, the price is very high. The family will remain a prisoner for their whole lives and will never be able to say no to the Camorra.
However, the traffic did not end with Carmine Schiavone's testimony, and there is evidence that it continues today, with high dioxin levels in the air polluting the agricultural products of the area. Although the mafioso indicated the waste landfills where he and his accomplices buried highly toxic waste, his account is just the tip of an iceberg that is just beginning to emerge now, one that is likely to dominate Italy's landscape for decades. The high incidence of certain cancers prompted Don Maurizio and activists in the area of Giuliano and Caivano to get together to protest. 30 years of cover-ups have left the population helpless and infuriated.
This is a Vassallo landfill. This, where we are now, is a weighing machine where the trucks were weighed and then the trucks were discharged. And there's proof that with 100,000 lira, or 50 of today's euros, trucks could be discharged without any form of checks. So the truck could have anything on board, but with 100,000 lira, they could discharge it. And the police had to manage the situation because the trucks were lined up out into the road.
Most worrying for the locals is that the site has never been stabilized and made safe, and the toxic liquids at the bottom of the landfill threaten to infiltrate the water table that serves millions of local residents. However, the mafiosi of the 1990s, who used their local power to illegally process dangerous waste, have since been rounded up. The problem, says Giovanni, is that the situation never changes.
The biggest problem is that the government, through the states of emergency, has allowed ordinary urban waste to be discharged here on top of the toxic waste buried below. So the harm that the very people who should have been protecting us have actually caused is unimaginable.
Smoke and gas continue to rise out of holes in the landfill. Toxic gases. And yet, close by, the local government of Giuliano has located a gypsy camp, and the children continue to play, avoid school, and engage in the burning of illegal garbage here. The land in this area is known as La Terra dei Fuochi, the land of fires, where toxic waste material is burned with rubber tires. This is a different form of toxic waste disposal from the deep burial of industrial refuse. Mauro Pagnano is a local activist, reporter and photographer and works with Maurizio Patriciello, parish priest of Caivano, to bring the issue to national and international attention.
Perché Terra dei Fuochi? Terra dei Fuochi si chiama in questo modo perché in realtà
Why Terra dei Fuochi? It's called the Land of Fires as a reference to the toxic fires, the activity by which the residues of textile, construction and other types of local industry are burned. So there are a number of factories that work illegally, then they have to dispose of waste illegally.
Una serie di fabbriche che lavorano a nero e che quindi per forza di cose devono smaltire a nero.
Mauro Pagnano and Father Maurizio work together with activists like Gianni to force the authorities to take action.
I asked the mothers that I knew who had lost their children, Mauro too, I asked Mauro, whom you know, if they were available to be photographed with their child. They said yes, and Mauro's great, and 11 of these mothers were photographed with the photo of their dead child in their arms, sitting on the bed in the child's room.
Del bambino morto tra le braccia, sedute sul lettino della loro cameretta.
E li fotografai, ho ascoltato tutte le loro storie.
I took their pictures after hearing their story, and the pictures were very simple, with the mother, with the picture of their kid in their hands in the child's bedroom. I didn't know how to use these pictures until Father Maurizio said, "Why don't we do something important?"
Un giorno Padre Maurizio mi disse, perché non facciamo qualcosa di importante?
We printed 150,000 postcards addressed to the Pope and to the President of the Republic. At the time, it was Giorgio Napolitano. And we told people to come and to get them free of charge, put a stamp on them. And the President's palace was flooded with these postcards. And the President called us in, and we went to the Quirinale Palace with 13 mothers who had lost their children.
The toxic waste hidden 30 years ago by criminal gangs working for international lobbies is still there. But another pressing problem is the thriving submerged economy of counterfeit clothing and footwear.
Quindi la camorra dei casalesi ha fatto, alleanza con gli industriali.
The Camorra of the Casalesi clan has allied with the dishonest industrialists, and this has allowed tons of industrial waste from the north of Italy to be offloaded into Campania. Then there are the Campania industries of shoes, bags and textiles, most of which work illegally. And since the product isn't registered by the financial police, so if they work illegally, obviously their waste has to be burnt.
Se lavorano in nero è normale che poi gli scarti vengano bruciati.
Burning rubber tires together with the waste ensures that there is no trace of what was being burned, but sends massive quantities of dioxins into the air.
Abbiamo trovato sversamenti di montagne di pneumatici, non può essere un singolo meccanico che lo va a buttare lì che magari.
We've found dumps with mountains of tires, so it's not a single mechanic who goes out to throw them away and doesn't want to pay the refuse tax. They could be companies who have the job of disposing of them. But I don't know. I don't think they all come from Campania, because it's impossible that they produce all these tires in this area. Sometimes they are used to make a big fire to delay its being extinguished, and that way hide other substances, because when they burn textile residues, there are solvents in them and other stuff that risk exploding.
Ci sono pure i solventi, c'è altra roba, no? Che può rischiare pure di esplodere.
The poor quarters of the Naples suburbs are the local mafia recruiting ground. breaking the bond between crime and poverty is almost impossible, and unemployment is high, says Father Maurizio.
Nel mio quartiere penso che raggiunga l'80%.
In my area, I think it reaches 80%. So sometimes I ironically say, by nature, if a person doesn't eat, he should die within 15 days. If he doesn't die, that means he eats. But if he's unemployed and earns nothing, how can he eat?
Ma se è disoccupato e non guadagna, come fa a mangiare?
Big industry and small producers living in the shadows together constitute a massive problem of waste control. Illegal and undeclared production processes make for illegal and undeclarable waste.
Se noi pensiamo a quanti venditori ambulanti ci sono in giro per l'Italia che vendono il falso.
If you think how many roaming merchants there are in Italy who sell counterfeit goods, you have to think that for every kilo of bag, there is at least half a kilo of waste. And where does all that end up? It's a problem. We all think of tax evasion as a problem, and we try to beat it. But we don't see tax evasion as having an effect on the environment.
Di ricadute sull'ambiente.
Giovanni has discovered another country road where the byproducts of illegal clothes manufacturing have been disposed of and asbestos has been dumped. In some places, rubber tires have been placed on top of the waste, ready to burn it, to destroy all trace of where it is from. This practice releases dioxins into the air.
It all started here, but this is happening all over Italy and even all over Europe. We have opened the Pandora's box. This is just the beginning of the issue of the toxic landfills in the whole of Europe.
Poverty and widespread illegal manufacturing have poisoned the economy and the health of the inhabitants of this area north of Naples. But the problem of disposing of toxic waste has become a Europe-wide phenomenon. The disposal of toxic waste in Italy has enriched the local mafias for at least 3 decades. Organised crime has been able to offer its services to the producers of toxic waste because it controls the territory.
Who made the money? The Camorra. In fact, it operates in construction, earth moving and cement, and in waste. They earn more from waste than from drugs. Also because with drug trafficking, you go to jail. With toxic waste, you get a fine. Whatever kind of refuse you are disposing of, all you risk is a fine.
The most delicate part of Andrea Palladino's investigation has concerned the extent to which the states involved knew what was happening.
If there are Italian entrepreneurs who were connected to the Swiss, British or Luxembourg financial networks, it would be interesting for the security of the state to know more, and for the security of the firms who do their work correctly, because this kind of traffic creates unfair trade advantages, because it lowers the cost. So, in actual fact, the secret services have probably done too little from what emerges.
I refer again to what Carmine Schiavone told me. For example, he trafficked cement. He was in construction. And he maintained that the secret services had him load weapons and toxic waste into the hold of the ships below. And then above were the products that were officially being transported by those ships, in this case, cement. They went to countries where there were rebel guerrillas, or organized or corrupt groups or politicians. Unfortunately, where there is poverty and unstable governments, there is a lot of corruption. And disposing of the toxic waste in those countries was paid for with arms. And in exchange, drugs were brought back.
Why governments wanted to keep how toxic waste was being disposed of a secret is a question no one seems to be able to answer. However, disposing of the byproducts of nuclear energy production seemed to be a particularly tough remit for the Italian governments of the 1990s.
C'è stata un'inchiesta importante della Procura di Matera che riguardava soprattutto un impianto, Tresaglia a Rotondella, vicino appunto a Matera.
There was an important investigation by the Procura of Matera that involved the Rotondella plant near Matera, where the investigating judge, Pace, noted that there was a lot of confusion with the registries. It was a plant that contained radioactive and dangerous waste, and during the investigation there was some reference to bad handling of the materials.
Italy's parliament has investigated the mysteries surrounding toxic waste disposal in the 1990s, and the results have been shocking. Carmine Schiavone and Francesco Fonti were just two of the witnesses called. The spread of the eco-mafias has been traced and recorded. Now it is time to control them, Europe-wide.
The safety testing is often left in the hands of the waste producer, and therefore the controls are not that strict.
Sicuramente le organizzazioni mafiose hanno avuto un ruolo importante, pensiamo soprattutto alla Camorra in Campania.
Certainly the mafia associations had an important role, and I'm referring especially to the Camorra in Campania. But at the heart of these environmental criminal organizations is the wider economic system that also uses the mafia to drastically lower the cost of waste removal.
Anche le mafie per poter abbattere drasticamente il costo di smaltimento dei rifiuti.
If the Camorra is able to manipulate the votes and get a politician elected, now that the sons of Camorristi and mafiosi go to school and university, the Camorra has its own children elected, so we find them in certain places.
However, there is an even more profitable line of trade for organized crime that has access to ships and controls local territory: migrants. Andrea Palladino has also traced where the mother ships that carry migrants from Turkey and Egypt to Europe come from.
E abbiamo ricostruito almeno 15.
We have traced back at least 15 cargo ships to the shipyards between August 2014 and January 2015 that were used for the transport of migrants to the Italian coasts. But above all, what struck us when analysing the ship owners was the overlap of trafficking. Among them was a ship that had been stopped by Greek authorities because it was transporting 20,000 Kalashnikovs, probably headed for Syria.
The Mediterranean Sea, these limpid waters, are also the site of lethal trafficking of people, arms, drugs, and toxic waste. Traffics covered by a conspiracy of silence. Uncovering the crimes of the past is revealing a deadly threat to future generations.
For decades, the nightmare of something lurking under the waves that might be dangerous has been weighing on this coastline and on its people.
Di qualcosa che sotto il mare può costituire un pericolo.
Illegal waste trafficking in the Mediterranean Sea enriches unscrupulous traders, destroys the environment, and gives their clients unfair trade advantages. These merchants of death, for at least 30 years, have profited from war and famine on Europe's doorstep.
Scavando fuori dai confini delle... When you dig outside the waste pits that are already mapped, the prosecutor's office has found, thanks to the forestry police, other waste pits. All it takes is a little bit of digging and you find barrels. Many barrels, very tall barrels, 200 liters each. The locals would talk of these trucks arriving, also from abroad, trucks with foreign license plates, and they were carrying these barrels, and we know also that there had been some very serious episodes, such as this worker named Giuseppe Stretti, who was enveloped as he was working by this toxic cloud, as he was moving the barrels, and he died immediately. He'd been fine beforehand.
Governments have failed to adequately protect and control the sea. If trade is the heart and soul of prosperity, illegal trafficking of all kinds has undermined the stability of the Mediterranean basin and has poisoned and impoverished its inhabitants. Women and children are maimed and killed every year by light arms, often trafficked illegally or even openly in a grey area of near legality used by governments to sponsor armed factions. This is the story of how individuals and states have profited from the civil wars around the Mediterranean's shores. Wars that have flooded the heart of Europe with their refugees, with terrorists and their weapons. Today, arms are being trafficked in and out of the Mediterranean and Black Sea ports and airports by smugglers, arms dealers, and even governments. There is a grey area between legal and illegal trade that bends the rules to allow the arms industries, states, and individuals to profit from conflicts where, despite arms embargoes in place, human rights are violated daily.
For most transfers of arms, the end-use certificate is okay, because most of these arms have a legitimate end use. But you know, there's always a problem of diversion of these weapons.
One thing that we've noticed and one thing that we've targeted recently, and actually this method started in Africa, is targeting what we call the super facilitators.
A Serbian prime minister told me at the press conference that he adores when he sells arms.
The tranquil city of Brussels, capital of Belgium and the heart of the European Union, is also a thriving hub for the small arms trade. It has been a hotbed of Islamic terrorist activity too. By a strange twist of history, the ingredients of an explosive cocktail of crime and terrorism came together here in 2016.
We have generations of firearms production knowledge which is being transferred from generation to generation. And people know that if you have guns and you want to do something with it, go to the people with the expertise. And this is interesting when you see that some of the weapons used in the Paris attacks in 2015 were actually deactivated guns that got reactivated in Belgium.
Brussels is also where the United States Department of Justice has located its European offices of the DEA, responsible over the past 2 decades for the arrest of 2 of the world's most notorious weapons traffickers.
Especially Mr. Alcazar was in fact what we identify as a super facilitator. And he was tied to both drug trafficking and he was tied to terrorist activity and arms sales.
The merchants of death have always existed. Men such as Monser Alcazar, who made his fortune in the wars of the 1980s and 90s, covertly dealing with governments and rogue states. He was accused of supplying arms for the Somali warring factions, allegedly in exchange for the disposal of toxic waste, through the facade of a shipping company, Shifco, that operated out of Gaeta in Italy. Monser Alcazar was arrested in Spain in 2005 and extradited to the United States. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, a combination of chaos, massive weapons stockpiles, and criminal entrepreneurship allowed its massive arms machine to fall into the hands of notorious arms dealers. After the 25th of December, the Soviet Union disappears unexpectedly, and this new reality of Russia appears. But all the money has disappeared too. Some members of the Russian military turned their hands to arms smuggling. Viktor But was an ex-Air Force officer who used a fleet of aircraft to transport Soviet weapons and military material anywhere in the world. He was arrested in Bangkok and accused of plotting to kill American citizens, which enabled the United States to have him extradited back to the USA in 2010.
We at the DEA target drug trafficking, and that's what we do. But if we stumble upon that these drug traffickers are also involved in terrorist activity, we obviously get our counterparts involved, and we go after these people the best way we can. And many times, because of some great laws in the United States that target terrorist organizations with ties to narco-trafficking, we have a nice tool in our toolbox that we can charge these folks in the United States, like we did with Mr. Boot and like we did with Mr. Kassar.
What happened to the Soviet reserves? Paolo Tamponi investigated.
In giro per il mondo troviamo questi capitali.
We find this capital hidden around the world, and this capital was used to buy up cheap, very cheap, the Russian gas production industries, as it was explained to me. According to some, it was the military origin of some of these that helped them lay their hands on this industry. So the connection that becomes apparent, or became apparent at the time, between the gas pipelines of Russia and the arms trade was described to us. As the communist world collapsed, so did Yugoslavia. In 1994, the wars raging in former Yugoslavia absorbed weapons and ammunition in quantities that had never been seen on European soil since the Second World War. It was the year the Jadran Express container ship was stopped in the Straits of Otranto. We were investigating Russian organized crime. And after one thing led to another, we discovered what we might describe as a ghost company in Turin, which is a city where I was working, managed by a Ukrainian person, a certain Dmitry Strashinsky. Dmitry Strashinsky was linked to the Jadran Express.
Legato alla Jadran Express.
Looking back today, it is possible to trace what happened to this one single lethal cargo that was destined for the Bosnian conflict zone and ended up, through government intervention, 20 years later in Iraq.
La Jadran, voi sapete,
as you know, the Jadran was stopped in the Adriatic Straits and taken to an Italian port, where the commander attempts to sink her. He fails, and this raises the suspicion of the investigators. And mixed in with containers full of copper wire and cotton bales, they found this enormous, I mean really enormous, cargo of weapons. The story Strashinsky told Tamponi spotlighted the open sore that was the post-Soviet Union Eastern Bloc. The Jadran Express was just the last of 12 cargo ships headed to the Slovenian port of Koper with arms for Croatia and Bosnia, countries under UN arms embargoes at the time.
Jadran.
The Jadran Express's intermediate port of call was the port of Venice, so the ship was to call in the port of Venice before proceeding to one of the ports of former Yugoslavia to supply the armies. This was enough and was sufficient to establish the jurisdiction of the Italian government. The investigation identified a Greek intermediary and two Russian nationals, Alexander Zhukhov and Leonid Lebedev, as the dealers, who were also the owners of an oil trading company. The suspects had interests in a gas and oil company, Syntes Oil. This led to the investigation extending to this company too. Zhukov, Lebedev, all people who were extremely respected in Moscow.
in Moscow.
According to Ukrainian witnesses, the arms were destined for the Slovenian port of Koper, where they were to be delivered to Croatian and Bosnian middlemen for use in the civil war that was ongoing at the time.
Nel corso del giudizio ordinario vennero portati dei testimoni.
During the trial, Ukrainian witnesses appeared, government employed, who declared, and possibly rightly, but we did not know this beforehand, that the cargo was under surveillance.
Che quel carico era stato sorvegliato.
As a result of this, and of declarations made by the Ukrainian government personnel, it was discovered that the ship was not due to go via Italy.
Emerse che la nave assolutamente non sarebbe dovuta passare dall'Italia.
So, as a result of these declarations, sworn under oath, the basis of Italian jurisdiction was eliminated.
Veniva a mancare il fondamento della giurisdizione.
When they were first captured, the judicial authorities ordered the arms to be destroyed, and they were taken to the super-secret NATO naval base on the Sardinian island of La Maddalena, where they were stocked, but not destroyed. Where did all these weapons from Eastern Europe sail from? Until recently, one of the most notorious arms smuggling hotspots was the Ukrainian port of Odessa, as well as its secret twins, Oktyabrsk and Mykolaiv.
Perché l'Ucraina passa a
Gas pipelines that end up in Odessa pass through the Ukraine, and the oil company was interested in controlling it.
Probabilmente questo interesse del passaggio aveva un costo.
And obviously, having the gas go through had a cost that was paid by a paying officer and a receiving officer, and within this was a deal to sell military material.
Nell'ambito di una compravendita di materiale bellico.
But today, things are changing in Odessa. The unlikely new sheriff in town is Yulia Marushevska.
I became known on Maidan after the video about what was happening. That was a very awful moment when first victims appeared, when snipers started shooting at people, and I wanted to tell the world about what was happening.
The 26-year-old Euromaidan activist has campaigned for democracy and reform in Ukraine and now heads the customs service overseeing cargo traffic at the port.
The most important smuggling, that's the smuggling of the drugs, weapons, alcohol, tobacco, like real smuggling. That's also a huge problem, and Odessa is a leader for that, for sure, because 65% of all goods that are coming to Ukraine, they're coming through Odessa.
For the last year, she has had perhaps the hardest job in town, reforming port operations and rooting out corruption, which is rife.
Odessa is a unique region for Ukraine, the biggest region with the 5 seaports. It's huge, full of people. It's the biggest exporter of grain with beautiful people, beautiful land, beautiful nature, beautiful seacoast, incredible beaches, but at the same time, completely destroyed roads, no institution. Now, Odessa is the only region, actually the biggest region between Crimea, occupied by Russia, and Transnistria, occupied also, I would say, by Russia.
She changed people, procedures, and protocols, ushering in a new automated system for clearing goods and simplified procedures, taking away the arbitrary power of individual customs officials to demand bribes and turn a blind eye on smuggled goods. Today, the port keeps a digital track of what is going where. But the project to improve transparency has faced stiff resistance.
Customs is one of the most corrupt areas. That's the place of the huge cash flow. That's an a very corrupt institution. And to create this, like island, like this clean island in this lake of corruption, it's really important for business. And this support is always with me. But on the other hand, of course, I have people who are like smugglers who couldn't work in Odessa anymore. They just changed and went to other customs when they still can negotiate.
In 2013, the Russians began sending heavy equipment to Syria on their own naval ships as well as cargo ships. And during 2015, they began buying up ships from Ukrainian and Turkish companies to convert them into transport vessels to supply their troops on the ground. Yulia still cannot see what weapons are going where because Defense, Interior and Intelligence ministries are able to bypass her authority.
As soon as something is happening with weapon smuggling, then the intelligence forces, they say that it's under our control, and the customs is kind of being replaced from the process. To control the smuggling of the weapons, that's you need a high secret clearance, and that's the problem of the national and international governments.
But Western governments have also been found to have supplied weapons for the Syrian conflict. US arms sold to Jordan have made their way into the hands of rebels. And the arms cache found aboard the Jadran Express was reported to have been delivered by the Italian government to the Kurdish militias fighting ISIL. The Italian government changed the law to make this trade possible, but has done nothing to track the arms' whereabouts.
Erano armi per la dotazione di un armamento di un esercito moderno.
They were weapons. They were equipment for a modern army. The arms confiscated were ordered to be taken away and destroyed. Also, because the arms were not of a type used by NATO, by which they could have been given to the forces that at that time were part of NATO, they were Kalashnikovs. So there was no economic interest in keeping them.
Firearms are very durable goods. Some of the weapons that are being found right now in the Middle East, in the conflicts in the Middle East, are weapons that are dating back from the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. So these weapons have been around for decades and have changed hands for decades. And that's very difficult. But it also means when you do export control, you have to take the long-term perspective. The weapons that we're exporting today, where will they end up tomorrow? But you also have to ask yourself the question, where will they end up in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years?
The Balkans Investigative Reporters Network and the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, NGOs supported by the European Union and, among others, the Norwegian and British foreign ministries, have investigated arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Their researchers have identified 68 cargo flights from ex-Soviet bloc countries supplying massive quantities of Soviet-designed arms to Syrian rebels, including ISIL, via apparently legal exports to Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Arms that do not equip their regular armies.
Those flights are cargo planes. Aviation companies, usually Ruby Star, that operates and that has the history of shifting, usually weapons to difficult and problematic countries, if I can say it like that, in the past. So it's the same Ilyushin flights that they were using these days, and they are actually still using them.
If you look at the weapons that Islamic State is fighting with today, a lot of the weapons are American weapons, American-made weapons. Why? Because these were weapons that were donated by the Americans to the troops of Iraq, who then lost them or sold them. Another chunk are the weapons which have been in the region for decades. Have been going from one conflict zone to another. And then you have a third group of weapons, I think, and these are the weapons which are being transferred more recently. Weapons which have been exported out of Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe legally only a couple of months ago.
I mean, only for the stuff that we checked, it's like over, I believe, 50,000 of tons. Because most of the arms are like grenades, are ammunition for mortars, mortar shells and mortars, AK-47 ammunition for them. So it's like it's a really huge amount of ammunition that it's transferred from this area to Middle East.
The governments of the Czech and Slovak republics, Bulgaria, Serbia and Croatia sold old stockpiles of weapons from the Cold War, as well as more recently produced weapons, to Saudi Arabia. It has been a windfall for these cash-strapped governments.
When you have a buyer who is interested in buying large amounts of weapons and you do need to get rid of it because you cannot keep it forever, and if you can earn additional money next to it, that's excellent in terms of, you know, economic policies for all of those countries. The other difficulty is that justified? Is that legal? Is the huge question. And what justifies economic, you know, profits when it comes to human lives?
In theory, you can do risk assessments and say, well, you know, how come somebody's suddenly buying a type of ammunition that they don't usually use, or a type of weapon system that they don't usually use? But ultimately, you have to understand this is, you know, it's business, it's big business. And I'm not personally promoting it, I'm just trying to understand that, you know, it's very difficult in situations where, you know, the kind of armament industry is a big employer in a certain country, you know, and it's, you know, kind of faltering. It's kind of a social problem that you're going to tell them, well, you know, don't sell this to Saudi, you know, don't open up a new market, especially when you have some of the big powers actually selling significant quantities there.
Serbia is not the largest nor producer nor the exporter of the arms in the region. Croatia is. Other countries in Central Europe are also bigger than Serbia. What makes Serbia important is actually that it became the hub for the flights, actually for the main place from, you know, picking up different sorts of weapons from different countries and then shifting it to Middle East and Turkey. Belgrade Airport became a place where most of those guns are piled, then, you know, airlift to Turkey or to Jordan or to Saudi Arabia most commonly.
There is a gray area somewhere. If you look at end user certificates, etc., it's a gray area. I mean, ultimately the system could be tighter on that side. But it also takes capacity, right? So sometimes you have to be also very, very realistic about how it works. You know, the US have actually very strong capacity on post-export controls. And they're very, very keen on ensuring that there is no diversion. So, you know, they will go back and control, but they also have a very extensive network of, you know, embassies that they can call on. If you have a small country like Montenegro, which altogether I think has about less than 30 embassies worldwide, and they sell somewhere where they don't, I mean, their ability to actually control where it went is much reduced, you know.
What they usually have is, and what all of those officials claim that they have, is end user certificates. And they claim it's enough. Well, in fact, the document itself shouldn't be enough, and it's not enough in terms of breaking different type of laws. They are obliged to follow 3 types of law: national law, EU law, and ATT, Arms Trade and Treaty. And what they usually do is that they own end user certificate, but they don't provide any additional information. Did good enough, you know, background check of the buyers.
Of course, the former Soviet bloc countries are not the only ones to supply weapons to potential areas of conflict.
Belgium is a relatively small arms exporter from European perspective because we don't have a large defense industry. But when you look specifically at firearms and ammunition, we're top 3 in Europe. You have Germany, you have Austria, and you have Belgium. To a lesser extent also Italy. But when you look specifically at arms export of firearms and ammunition to the Middle East, Belgium is number 1 in Europe, and it has been number 1 for years.
So what I'm very keen actually to stress here is to we need to be a bit fairer to the countries in the Balkans. You know, there's small players on that market. I think they got a lot of bad press recently, which doesn't mean that, you know, they should have. I mean, generally, I think we advocate, you know, smaller sales of arms, etc. But I think we just need to be fair to them and understand that, you know, it's a competitive environment, and it's one where when you have a big legitimate buyer, you know, it's a big, you know, serious state. It's not a failing state. It's not, you know, it's not a state that has an internal, you know, conflict, etc. Then it's very difficult to make that argument you shouldn't sell.
Belgium's light arms company, FN Herstal, actually sold a batch of 200 rifles to Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. What happened to these and the millions of other Libyan weapons is a source of concern.
What we've seen after the fall of Gaddafi is that many of these firearms ended up in the hands of all kinds of non-state actors. And we've seen that these weapons have been used across Libya, but also in other parts of North Africa. Some of these weapons might have even ended up in Palestine. So we're seeing a proliferation of small arms in North Africa, partly as a result of the collapse of Gaddafi's reign. Not just Belgian arms, but European arms. And these weapons are spreading to the south of the continent, but there's also fear in Europe that these weapons might actually end up going north, across the Mediterranean and into the hands of criminals or even terrorists in the streets of Brussels, Paris, Amsterdam, and so on.
States still employ private defense and security contractors and arms dealers as middlemen, however.
There are middlemen, actually. There are companies that are dealing with that. From Serbia, it's usually CPR Impacts is one of the companies that is dealing with those sorts of trade, I would say. There are other companies which we are trying to target in different countries. On some of those arms, you can even see the dealer's name, like Ahaloy from Bulgaria is one of as well. You can see their a mark on the boxes of weapons that are distributed and then ended up in Syria.
CPR Impex recently bought a stake in Montenegro defense industry, a strategic move for a company that prefers to keep its dealings quiet.
In Montenegro, MDI had approached to the port of Bar, which is one of the, especially in previous area, was one of the important hubs for arms trade, because Bar is privatized port, and most of the arms trade went through that port. So from a logistical point of view, it's very much important that you have some sort of, possibility where you can ship weapons.
With Montenegro negotiating entry to NATO, having a base there seems logical.
CPR Impacts weren't able to sell weapons through Serbia that easily, and Montenegro actually opened the whole new chapter for them. So it's a good business move.
From the disarmingly peaceful countryside of Castell'Arquato, near Piacenza, Italy, a controversial dealmaker weaves his web of businesses across Africa. He has been described as the Lord of War and accused of attempting to sell 500,000 Kalashnikovs to Libya in 2005. But Vittorio Dordi denies it all.
I started with the Congo in 1998 when I met, outside Congo, in Switzerland, a minister, the Minister for Petrol, Mpoyo, and he introduced me to the president, Laurent Désiré Kabila. And the president told me that the only resources available were those for building an air force, and since I spent 20 years in Russia and spoke Russian, he asked me to accompany a delegation to go and look for what they needed. I accepted the job, for which I have an official letter of engagement written by the ministry, and I was given a diplomatic passport for this job, and that's how I got into this field.
Tutto si svolgeva praticamente all'estero.
It all happened abroad. The suppliers were of diverse origins. The case that interested us were the 500,000 Kalashnikovs. Chinese-made Kalashnikovs, let's say, imitations. They came from a Chinese company. that was well known in the arms sector.
Una ditta cinese, nota nel settore degli armamenti. Destinazione, in questo caso la Libia.
Their destination was Libya in this case. Then there were the beginnings of a deal with Iraq for the same material, AK-47 Kalashnikov-type weapons, and massive ammunition supplies.
Mitragliatori tipo Kalashnikov e munizionamento anche ingenti.
The first intercepted call that tipped off investigators was made in a city close to Perugia, where a small-time drugs dealer mentioned Dordi's name while discussing an arms deal in Libya. Dordi himself went to Libya to meet the potential buyer. The case was assigned to prosecutor Dario Razzi.
E caso volle che questo soggetto dedito allo spaccio locale era.
By chance, this person who operated in local drug peddling was a small player in a gang that dealt with other things, and he had a lowly role.
Uno di questi appunto quello di recarsi.
One of his jobs was to go to Libya for reasons that were unclear, so we ordered a check on his luggage after the check-in, and we found all kinds of weapons catalogues.
Relative, diciamo, ad armi.
These people who had been working in Libya for some time were looking for weapons, and they called me when I was in the Congo. They called me several times saying, "You work with Russia, give us a hand." And it is clear from the phone calls and from the transcriptions that I say, no, I am not interested. It's not something I am able to do. In any case, I represent a company that makes aircraft and helicopters. I know absolutely nothing about the Kalashnikovs.
Prosecutors claim Vittorio Dordi is one of Italy's biggest arms traffickers, owning an arms dealership in Cyprus that represents warplane and helicopter manufacturers. His experience in working with the arms industry and sub-Saharan governments sheds light on who monitors what is really happening behind the scenes.
I went to speak with the CIA. Basically what happened, the CIA said to me, "Do you have time to waste? We're talking about a country that released an end-user certificate for 5 guns and they were sent. What do you want to do? Nothing. If they really want to buy 500,000 guns, then call us and we'll intervene."
This is the first time an arms smuggling case has brought about convictions in Italy, with 2 of the dealers handed a 2-year suspended jail sentence, and Dordi himself being found guilty by the court of first instance, although he has appealed and is awaiting the final judgment.
This business of the Kalashnikovs, they were speaking of 1 million Kalashnikovs at the beginning. It's unrealistic because the Chinese factory, the largest is Norinco, would have taken 5 years to make them without satisfying their other clients. So it's an unrealistic number of guns. It's as though Mercedes makes 500,000 cars a year, and I go and ask them, as a private individual, for 2.5 million cars. Mercedes would say, "Sorry, but you have some problem."
Fighter jets, MiG-25B models are available. These are contacts that never turned into anything. It's just to say that there was everything except for nuclear weapons. It came out that one of them has a minority stake in a company whose main shareholder was the main Russian aircraft producer.
In cui il socio dominante era la principale industria russa di aviazione.
At that time, the Democratic Republic of the Congo was not under embargo, so was free to acquire whatever it wanted. And we created this Air Force, a small Air Force, typical of an African country, and I entered this sector by chance and became the sales representative for the Georgian company that produces the Sukhoi 25.
The weighty indictment against Vittorio Dordi contains transcripts of telephone conversations between him and the original instigators of the deal.
There are 5 telephone calls. In all the questionings of the others involved, they declared that I had nothing to do with this, that they did everything without me. They asked me for my help, but didn't get it, and they did everything without me. The result is that after 8 years, I'm still waiting.
Often, the arms shipments arrive in small merchant ships at less important ports, with loading and unloading at secluded sites used by smugglers for centuries. The Haddad 1 was stopped close to Crete. Aboard were 5,000 pump-action shotguns, 500,000 9mm rounds of ammunition, and 46,000 cigarettes. Greek authorities believe it was bound for Misrata, which at the time was under the control of Libyan Dawn. The ship's last port of call was Iskenderun, Turkey, 50 kilometers from the Syrian border. The ship was later released after the intervention of the Turkish government, claiming that although Haddad 1 was bound for Libya, the guns were for Sudan. The role of Turkey in arms manufacturing and export on the very frontiers of Europe is controversial. In November 2015, another cargo of Turkish-made Winchester pump guns was intercepted in the port of Trieste with incomplete paperwork. The weapons were destined for Belgium and the Netherlands. Dozens of ferries and cargo ships enter the port of Trieste every week, but monitoring what they carry is tough. Customs and port authorities rely on a formula that triggers checks on potentially high-risk vessels. Even the Italian government often turns a blind eye or even promotes the sale of weapons to countries under embargo.
In 2001, a country like Libya under embargo wants to buy patrol boats, but the Italian company that makes them can't sell them because they can't get an end-user certificate. So the government passes a decree that lasts 6 months that says that the end-user certificate is no longer necessary, so they are sold via an offshore company and reach their destination without an end-user certificate.
The most widely trafficked weapon the world over is the AK-47, the Kalashnikov. It was invented by Igor Kalashnikov when he was wounded at the end of World War II. It is neither the most accurate nor the lightest of all weapons, but it is robust and can be broken down into a dozen pieces that are easily cleaned and smuggled.
If you look at our neighborhood today, we can say that North Africa has a serious problem of proliferation of firearms. The Middle East, with all the conflicts going on there, it's very clear that there's a lot of weapons out there. And when you look at the eastern border, you see the Ukraine, with a lot of an incredible proliferation of firearms. Now, at the moment, we don't see a lot of evidence of these weapons ending up back in the streets here in Western Europe. But if we don't pay attention, if we don't take the necessary measures to prevent this, we might end up with a problem that's much bigger than the problem we have with the Balkans today.
In fact, the whole of Eastern and Southeastern Europe is awash with AK-47s and their local derivatives.
In terms of the illicit trafficking, the dangers for Western Europe is the proximity to this area, which is still a relatively recent post-conflict area, and these are remnants of war. So the danger is the nature of the trafficking. So this kind of micro trafficking that's happening currently, the porous nature of the borders, the fact that the EU borders have moved closer into the Balkans. And then it's actually really a simple supply and demand problem. You have supply on this side, people willing to sell, and you have definitely an increased demand within Western Europe for firearms, both in terms of organized crime, but also terrorism, as we've seen.
Supply and demand are meeting each other, and this is where it gets interesting, because the perpetrators of these terrorist attacks are often linked to the criminal underworld. These were people that were often convicted for criminal violence, drugs trafficking, and so on. They spent time in prison, often radicalized in prison, and then used their criminal skills to acquire firearms that are very suitable for terrorist activities.
While a Kalashnikov might cost €250 in Belgrade, it can be sold for €2,000 in a European city such as Brussels, where the firearms industry enjoys a long tradition, going back centuries. Concerns are growing that these weapons are increasingly being used for for terrorism and organized crime.
One of the things also to look into, if you want to look at, especially the European market internally, right, is the demand side, and I think that hasn't been looked into enough. There's always this pressure on, okay, the supply is coming, but the supply wouldn't be coming if somebody wasn't buying it.
Gare du Midi, Belgium, is one of the places where gangsters and jihadists used to be able to buy weapons. The market for small arms and light weapons is estimated conservatively at $1 billion annually, with black markets adding another $200 million to the pot.
One thing that we've noticed and one thing that we've targeted recently, and actually this method started in Africa, is targeting what we call the super facilitators. These are people that can do various amounts of illegal activity, from arms sales to narcotic sales to human smuggling. They have their hands in all sorts of different crimes. DEA, along with our counterparts, have started to target these organizations, and by targeting the organizations, not only are we disrupting drug trafficking organizations, we're disrupting terrorist organizations that are operating pretty much with impunity all over the world.
The rise of West African organized crime, trafficking drugs, arms and people, operating alongside the terrorist organization Boko Haram, has added a new danger to Europe's streets, a new level of despair and instability in Africa.
They are fighting in Nigeria also to ask me to do what is not under my religion, because I'm a Christian.
I have a problem because my father is a politician, and he got himself into one mess or the other because of politics. So my family, generally, no one is at home now, and my father is dead because of the same issue.
La population voulait manifester, eh bien, ils ont arrêté la population de ne pas à se manifester. Mais ces jours-là, ils ont commencé porte à porte, ils ont fait, il y avait des morts et plusieurs blessures. Et ils m'ont poursuivi, ils m'ont même tiré, j'ai reçu le balle. Ouais.
People tend to see arms export to the Middle East as not connected to the illegal market here in Europe, but they are. As long as we keep exporting massive amounts of these weapons into the Middle East, and some of these weapons end up in the hands of all kinds of non-state actors, you have the risk that these weapons will eventually end up in our own streets. And this is where it gets interesting. And this is something that's not made. Arms export control is seen as foreign policy. Fighting the illicit gun market is seen as an interior policy. And I think we need to go beyond that. If we want to avoid the Balkan scenario in a much worse situation, we need to start connecting internal security and external security.
One of the documents that we found from our sources is directly in written saying that this can affect Serbia in many levels, and that's the important bit. From one side, yes, you're providing profit, but from the other side, you're endangering your position in EU, which is one of the first Serbian priorities. You're endangering both of your position with EU actually and Russia, because in this wartime thing, Russia is on the other side, it's on Assad's side, and the weapons that Serbia is selling goes strictly to the hands of rebels. So you're actually putting Serbia in both ways, like, it's not safe.
Ruthless arms suppliers who thrive in the grey area of a technically legal but morally dubious arms trade are fueling military violence across the Mediterranean, where the undetected passage of lethal cargo puts Europe's citizens at risk every day. The smuggling routes across the sea, between secluded ports where illicit goods, including arms, are trafficked, are today being overshadowed by state-sponsored deliveries of arms and ammunition. Millions of refugees from these proxy wars, fueled by the arms trade, are making the desperate journey to Europe. Europe is the new frontier for the South American crime cartels, while imports of Afghan heroin have never been so massive. The Mediterranean Sea is the crossroads of this deadly trade from east and west, creating new urgency to thwart this silent, lethal cargo. The globalization of crime has brought about an incredible intermingling of drug trade routes. Instability due to the failed war in Afghanistan has led to a 300% increase in the quantity of heroin hitting the European market. In the United States, the market is so flooded with Latin American cocaine that dealers have turned their sights to more profitable Europe. Never before has Europe been so awash with drugs. Much of it comes through the Mediterranean Sea via container ships.
Well, drug trafficking in general is an evolving profession for these criminals. And what they try to do is capitalize their profits. And one of the best ways they can capitalize their profits is to mitigate risk. And of course, risk is international law enforcement. So they're constantly looking for new routes, new avenues to get their drugs to wholesale markets and ultimately consumer markets.
The 'ndrangheta is capable of paying for a cargo even when that cargo is lost.
You guys are buying it. If you stop buying it, maybe the people in Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil and all the rest of it will stop selling it.
The drug smuggling routes follow the great trafficking highways which have changed over the years as criminal organizations have spread their web of alliances. The old tobacco and opiate routes from the east still exist, but new routes have opened up from the west as criminal organizations have expanded globally and exploited law enforcement loopholes to organize their trade. Not only drugs, but arms and people too. Italy has been at the forefront of Europe's battle against drug smuggling ever since Palermo in the 1980s became the capital of Europe's heroin production under the umbrella of the Cosa Nostra crime syndicate. The business was so profitable that soon other criminal organizations, the Camorra in Naples and the Sacra Corona Unita in Bari, also began using their ports to move drugs. Eventually, though, cocaine and the 'ndrangheta would supersede all the others. The Camorra and Cosa Nostra have today been largely sidelined by the notoriously violent Calabrian mafia, the 'ndrangheta, whose global reach has turned Italy into a central hub for the international trafficking of drugs and other lethal cargo, which, of course, no longer need to pass through Italy at all.
L'Andrangheta sicuramente ha sfruttato quello che inizialmente è stato il proprio core business, ovvero
The 'ndrangheta took advantage of what initially was the core business, the kidnapping of people. The investment in the cocaine market generated what is today a leadership in that market.
Sicuramente una leadership di questo mercato.
Probably when in Italy, more than the 'ndrangheta, there was a concentration on the other criminal organizations.
Su altre organizzazioni criminali.
But at the time, like they still do today, the 'ndrangheta was quietly expanding its networks not only in Italy and invested in this flourishing cocaine market and building personal relationships directly with the producing organizations.
Della cocaina, andando a intrecciare dei rapporti personali direttamente con le organizzazioni produttrici.
Drug trafficking is a global threat that has required law enforcement agencies worldwide to collaborate closely. Here in Brussels, the United States Justice Department runs a key office of the DEA, directed by James Allen.
Yeah, originally, well, back in 2006, I was the regional director for DEA for the what we call Middle East Southwest Asia region, which included Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way through Turkey and the STAN states. What we typically worked with our Turkish counterparts at that time was heroin trafficking, and heroin trafficking basically up through the Balkan route, which is a very traditional route through Romania, Bulgaria, up through Croatia, and then into Europe.
The Balkan route, once the hub for heroin trafficking of the 1980s and 1990s, is now changing. Once the Albanian gangs used the migrant crisis of the 1990s to get their wares into Italy, and from there to the big centers of Naples and Palermo. Heroin was sent from Europe to the USA. It was the time of the great mafia trials and the first contacts between the Colombian cartels and Italian organized crime.
What we've seen as we worked these massive organizations, mostly Albanian and Turkish, where they were not only using the Balkan route, but they were starting to use what we call the northern route, which is through the Stans and then into Russia and then trickling down into Europe, and also what we call the southern route, which is going down through Pakistan, across the Makran coast into East Africa, across the West Africa, and then up through Europe and sometimes the United States.
Smuggling in and out of Eastern Europe and the Balkans is still small scale, however, compared to the massive growth in the cocaine market. Cocaine is trafficked to Europe mostly by sea, often in container shipments. Colombia remains the main source of the cocaine found in Europe, but direct shipments to Europe from Peru and Bolivia, without ever having passed through North America, are becoming increasingly common. In fact, smugglers are increasingly using the hundreds of ports of the Mediterranean to smuggle vast quantities of cocaine into Europe. London is one of Europe's lucrative markets. The cocaine trade in the UK began 20 years ago.
And the first 1,000 kilo load, which was smuggled into Europe and smuggled in by a British crime group from Liverpool, they brought it in through Amsterdam, and they did that by flying over to Venezuela, making contacts with Venezuelan drug dealers. Then they came back to, and the drug dealer said to him, we will give you 1,000 kilos on tick, on credit, if you can get the transport from Venezuela to Europe. So they flew back, they bought a boat. They'd never sailed a boat in their lives. They sailed it to Cape Verde on a test run. They thought, yeah, we can do this. They sailed it to Caracas, or port in Venezuela. They picked up the gear, and then they sailed it right into Amsterdam. And that was the first 1,000 kilo load, which that and crime group ever did. Lots of other people in Liverpool watching this, and they thought, well, if they can do it, we can do it. So they all moved over to Amsterdam, and they did it themselves.
There are several ways cocaine enters the European market. Some big hauls have been uncovered in containers coming directly from South America, while others have been transported by mothership to the European or West African coast before being transferred to smaller vessels. Some cocaine is left as payment to West Africans for their assistance, which they then move on their own behalf, sometimes even by commercial air couriers. Gangs from Nigeria, who rely on a global web of Nigerian communities to ply their deadly trade, have found yet another way to take advantage of some of the most marginalized Africans who are caught up in the migrant crisis. The sheer size of Africa and a lack of any form of transnational policing makes drug trafficking nearly impossible to track. The world's leaders in drug smuggling, however, are Italian. Today, the largest criminal organization in Europe is the loose affiliation of Calabrian gangs and clans known as the 'Ndrangheta. The Italian finance police in Catanzaro is on the front line combating their terrifying power.
Qualunque organizzazione criminale fa del lucro, del guadagno, la propria ragion d'essere.
Every criminal organization exists to make a profit.
Le organizzazioni criminali di arrestare i partecipi alle stesse, di sequestrare i carichi.
Apart from destroying the criminal organization, arresting those participating and confiscating the cargoes of cocaine are not, I'd like to underline, are not the first objective. Our first objective is to build a picture of the criminal clan, identify its members, understand the roles, document its structure, and offer the judicial authorities enough investigative material to use in the trial as undeniable evidence, so as to deliver these criminals to justice once and for all.
Di dibattimento delle prove incontrovertibili al fine di assicurare alla giustizia in modo definitivo questi criminali.
The illegal drug market in Europe is worth 24 billion euros a year. These outlawed substances are consumed by millions of Europeans, and as their cost decreases, the market base widens. Cocaine is Europe's most widely used illegal stimulant, with an estimated 3.6 million people over the age of 15 having sniffed, snorted, or injected it in the last year. It is second in seizures, behind only cannabis. Cocaine is trafficked to Europe via both air and sea. The 'Ndrangheta has gained control not only of the supply side of the market, but also the places of import. Using the high seas to smuggle people, waste, arms, and drugs is a serious threat to international trade and regional stability, as over 90% of global trade is carried out by sea. The rip-on, rip-off method, which involves putting the illegal goods into the container and then taking them out once it arrives in port, substituting the shipper's seals, is increasingly preferred to traditional concealment. It is perfect for ports where corruption is rife. The Italian 'Ndrangheta has a man in every one of them.
Ancora oggi possiamo tranquillamente dire come l''Ndrangheta non solo sia egemone e utilizzi i porti.
Still today, we can easily say that the 'Ndrangheta is not only using the Italian ports with commercial routes from those countries, but also using commercial routes that involve American cargoes arriving in Northern Europe.
In porti, per esempio del Nord Europa, parliamo di Rotterdam.
Like Rotterdam, Germany and Holland, and then transporting the drugs by truck to the national markets. They also do business with other criminal groups in the drug market, for example, by getting it to arrive in Spain and then subdividing it between local Spanish criminal gangs and the part that then goes to the 'Ndrangheta.
Da far arrivare per esempio in Spagna e poi ripartirla quota parte per la delinquenza spagnola e quanto invece di competenza dell''Ndrangheta.
Well, again, you know, the drug trade is like any other business, and the traffickers, the South American kingpins, are going to move their cocaine to where they can make the most money. So throughout the years, at first, the markets were in the United States, where typically back in the 70s and early 80s, a kilogram of cocaine was going from anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000. Because they have flooded the market in the United States, now you can buy a kilogram of cocaine for under $15,000 in some parts of the United States. So these drug traffickers started to look for different markets because they flooded the United States market. So they saw that there was a ripe market in Western and Eastern Europe.
Spain has got Spain and Britain have got the highest prevalence of cocaine use in Europe, and that's because the gear comes into Spain, and therefore it's cheap, and a lot of people use it and distribute it in Spain. And there's a big market in Britain because we're a rich country full of people who like to take drugs. You know, not only working class people, middle class people is a huge market. Therefore, there's a huge prevalence. And it was the Mexican ambassador to the UK who told me that. And the point he was making is that and he was speaking for the whole of South and Central America, is that the crime groups in South and Central America have refocused their sales from the States to Europe because they can make a living at it. There's people who will buy it.
The story shifts to Spain and the ports of Cadiz and Valencia. Spain is, by cultural affinity, the closest port of call for the South American cartels. Daniel Santiago leads Spain's elite Greco organized crime investigation unit.
Principalmente la relación de los narcotraficantes.
Principally, the narco-traffickers' relationship with Spain is basically that they come from producing countries, which is something I follow. They are Colombian and from other South American countries, but mainly Colombian, and there are various reasons. The main one going back to the time of the Schengen Treaty. And since the easiest place for a South American to enter is Spain, because it is easy for them to get in, get resident status, it's the place where they can hide best, because this is where the largest Colombian and Latino American community lives. A lot of people, most of whom do legal jobs, so here they get lost in the crowd. They don't attract attention.
Donde ellos se pierden, o sea, no llaman la atención.
Today, the European cocaine market is so valuable that Colombian producers are prepared to take enormous risks in order to get massive quantities across the Atlantic, hiding it in containers.
El camuflaje de drogas normalmente se utiliza cuando es bien por vía de contenedores o bien por vía de...
The camouflage is usually done with containers or else with drug mules. Usually it comes in by ship. There are many methods. A method that I would call camouflage, for example, involved pineapples from Costa Rica, in which the pineapples, they were in a container of pineapples. They had opened the pineapples, extracting the flesh of the pineapple, filled it with a container painted yellow, closed the pineapple completely.
Unos cilindros de cocaína pintados, o sea, cubiertos con una cera amarilla, metido y cerrado la piña con pegamento.
In the fruit boxes themselves, the cocaine was hidden between the layers of cardboard.
De las cajas de fruta se pueden meter láminas de cocaína.
The same goes for shoes. In a recent case, the sole of the shoe is corrugated and the cocaine is placed in the spaces, which are then covered by a plastic sheet.
In December 2015, importers tried a new, ingenious way of hiding their cargo.
It was in the port of Cadiz, and when the cargo was opened, they thought it was mixed in with the charcoal. The surprise was that it was mixed. It was inside the pallets. Why was it surprising? Because the pallets looked as though they were of wood. Usually we are looking for a hiding place, something that's been painted, or it's in a tank, but no, this time if you touch it, if you handle it, it seems like wood.
The heist was coordinated with the National Crime Agency in the UK, working on a tip-off. It was worth 240 million euros on the European market.
It was a shipment of charcoal with a total of 1,520 kilos of cocaine, of which 550 kilos were hidden in the charcoal, and the pallets used to carry the charcoal were made of 1,400 kilos of cocaine. We worked with the NCA, the English, in this operation, and we arrested 4 people in Spain, and they arrested another 6 people in Dubai and Liverpool. We also found a very large laboratory to be used to extract the cocaine from the pallets.
They will own or have control of a huge container ship or part of that ship. That's how much pull they've got. And they will, several groups will invest in a big load, maybe 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 kilo loads of cocaine, cannabis, heroin, even though this may be coming from South America. And then they will bring it over and they will beach it in Spain either directly into a port or they will, off coast, they will bring it in on smaller vessels.
We have seen a dramatic increase in the amount of cocaine seizures that are occurring in the ports throughout Europe, specifically Spain, Italy, Holland, where before we were seeing multi-hundred kilogram seizures. Now we're seeing multi-ton seizures on a regular basis. Now that's twofold. The reason's twofold. One, there's a good market here. Two, and secondly, there is a glut of cocaine available in South America. So they're literally flooding Europe as they did the United States back in the 90s.
Traditionally, Spain has been a haven for criminals. Now, in addition to that, it's also a good place to smuggle drugs into from South America and Central America because of its coastline and because of the historical connections. So criminals who based themselves there became very good drug dealers, and they were able to beach drugs in Spain and then transport it back to Liverpool or London for distribution.
The drugs were destined for the UK market via ports in the Netherlands.
Nosotros, por la información que manejamos y por nuestras investigaciones,
as far as the information we have is concerned, the main route of entry for cocaine into Europe through the use of containers is deviating from Spain to the Netherlands. Obviously, they use Spain still, but a massive amount goes to Holland, much more than through Spain, and that's affecting the price, which is much cheaper in Holland than in Spain.
Listen, if you're a crime reporter, Amsterdam is a great place to do stories about because, well, for many different reasons, it's got a big crime heritage. People have been dealing drugs there for 30, 40 years, so it's well established. It's in the fabric of their society. There are lots of crime groups from all over the world. You know, you get Vietnamese, you get Croatian, you get Yugoslavs, Russians, you get lots and lots of British gangsters, and according to the National Crime Police in Holland, they effectively run Amsterdam. Isn't that they're the senior crime group who people deal with.
Actually identifying the ships that are worth intercepting is a nightmare for the overstretched police forces of Europe. Most of the ships are targeted based on a points system that analyzes risk based on who owns the vessels and their port of call history.
1,800 ships follow this route. Sailing boats, container ships, fishing vessels. It's a very busy route. If we were talking about cars, you ask, why not set up a roadblock? Where do you set up a roadblock, and what car would you stop? I'd stop an old car with 4 strange people aboard. I'd stop it, but you're in a place where 1,000 cars go by, and you can't stop all of them.
The ships at risk of carrying cocaine are identified as those with African crews, or older ships on their last voyage, or ships that stop off in suspect ports.
Normally, there are 2 types of boats carrying cocaine, and we're talking boats, not container ships. They are sailboats or fishing boats. What we look out for in a sailboat is the crew, people traveling alone or 2 people whose financial profile wouldn't be such that you'd expect them to be on a journey like that. For example, a Bulgarian. We stopped one recently, a Bulgarian who traffics drugs with other people in his country, goes to the Caribbean, buys a boat in the Caribbean, and returns home in the boat alone. This isn't normal.
Coge un barco en el Caribe y se ve él solo en el barco. Pues no es muy normal.
Other import techniques involve smugglers using fishing boats and offloading the drugs at sea.
Respecto al tema de pesqueros, es una ruta que ha bajado un poco, ya no es tan común como antes.
Talking about fishing boats, it's a technique that is less used now but was common earlier, and we identify them more or less by their profiles. Usually they are very old fishing boats, probably on their last voyage. They are so decrepit that their owners wouldn't send them out under normal circumstances. Close to the Spanish coast, they offload and then they sink. They let them sink, obviously not with the crew aboard, The crew gets off. They buy these boats because it's their last voyage from South America to Spain or Europe, and the crews usually come from over there, from poor countries, Venezuela or the Caribbean, or they are mixed crews that include Africans, Europeans, and the South Americans.
Apart from the massive cargoes sent to supply the growing demand for cocaine in Europe, there are also smaller quantities being shipped using simple methods.
The most common method is called blind pickup in Spanish, or in English, rip-off, rip-on. You have a legal business. You are a legal person. I have a legal business, and I'm a legal person. You send me fruit from South America, nothing but fruit, a legal cargo. This container is in the port of any country. Without you knowing it, a worker of the port opens the container and puts bags or backpacks with cocaine inside the container. They close the container, and the container comes to Spain, to me, with my legal business, importing fruit. This container comes to a Spanish port, and workers in the Spanish port open the container, take out the bag, and close the container. So that means you and I have transported drugs in our container without knowing it, because you are legal, I am legal, and it is a legal business.
Quando lo stupefacente è diretto in porti altamente, diciamo così, controllati come quello di Gioia Tauro.
When the drugs are headed to highly controlled ports, like that of Gioia Tauro, we often come across a great capacity of the criminals to hide the cargo.
Grande capacità delle consorterie criminali di celare i carichi. È vero che molte indagini hanno dimostrato come spesso
It's true that many investigations have shown how they can count on unfaithful workers inside the port structure that guarantee that they will recover the cargo.
Ovviamente il recupero dei carichi.
It is no longer only the South American cartels that are importing cocaine. In 2016, a drug smuggling ring based in Chechnya was broken up in Spain.
La operación Draco-Grozda se centraba sobre un grupo de nacionales chechenos.
We concentrated on a group of Chechen origin that was led by an ex-member of the Chechen Special Forces, and it was subdivided into groups or cells of not more than 2 or 3 people, each of which had a specific task within the group. The special trait this criminal gang presented was the distribution of tasks, making it resemble an almost military organization, so that one member of the cell did not know exactly what the others were doing.
In September 2016, the police of Valencia again found a half-ton cargo of cocaine and 150 kilos of marijuana in an apartment rented by the gang. They also discovered a laboratory where the cocaine could be processed and subdivided into saleable units.
Esa organización, ese grupo criminal, había alquilado.
This organization, this criminal gang, rented a series of apartments in the suburbs of the city of Valencia and looked for houses in urban centers far from the center of town. These houses had to have certain characteristics, such as easy access for the entry and exit of the drugs, and had to be in an area with many neighbors so as to pass unobserved more easily and make inspection by police forces more difficult.
Control por parte de las fuerzas de seguridad.
The Chechen traffickers used every trick to protect the drug stashes.
Como le digo, una vez que se guardó la sustancia estupefaciente en la casa,
as far as finding the drugs in the house is concerned, they didn't just hide it, they walled it up. It was hidden in the ventilation system, the walls, in the furniture, above and below, so that we literally had to break down the walls to get to the drugs. It happened that the registers of the quantities held in the houses showed what they held as small quantities so that the police might find a part of the stash and not continue with the search, and would not find the whole quantity they held.
La totalidad de la sustancia estupefaciente en dichas viviendas.
El laboratorio típico que hay en España es en España y en Europa.
The typical laboratory that you find in Spain, not only in Spain but in Europe, are laboratories for cutting and adulteration of the drugs. With the new methods that exist, we are finding laboratories for transforming the drugs. They are essentially chemical laboratories. The Greco unit found a laboratory with sulfuric acid, boric acid, kerosene with many products because they had to be able to break down the pallets made of cocaine mixed with other extraneous materials, such as wood and plastic, and extract it, separate it. So it is a laboratory designed to extract cocaine.
Esos pisos eran única y exclusivamente elegidos por el miembro más importante de la
This apartment was occupied by the most important member of the organization, the leader, who has a criminal record for arms and drugs trafficking and prostitution, among other crimes committed in this country. And as I said, he was the leader of the group we rounded up and was supported by others, the cell that organized the logistics of the organization.
Spain seems to be the frontier of the cocaine trade, the place where, today, the floodgates are open. On the other side of the Mediterranean, in Italy, Michele Di Nunno is the Calabrian coordinator of the National Organized Crime Investigation Unit at the Finance Police, the GICO, and has been monitoring the rise of the Calabrian organized crime gang known as the 'Ndrangheta. This organization is especially difficult to keep track of due to its low hierarchies and multi-family organization. Fear of the 'Ndrangheta, notorious for its cruelty, guarantees secrecy and loyalty among its clan members. This deeply ingrained culture of secrecy and loyalty has gained it the trust of the Colombian cartels. In July 2016, Italy's anti-mafia prosecutor Franco Roberti and the GICO announced the arrest of 144 people between Colombia, Costa Rica and Italy at the end of a surveillance and interception operation named Due Mari, which was the Italian part of an ongoing DEA campaign known as Angry Pirate 2.
L''Ndrangheta faceva arrivare in Italia lo stupefacente.
The 'Ndrangheta imported the drugs into Italy. Our investigation began because, as we were following certain members of families in the Ionian area of the province of Reggio Calabria, we were seeing a lot of trips of these people back and forth from Costa Rica.
Dei viaggi di questi soggetti verso il Costa Rica.
The cocaine delivered to multiple ports in Italy originated in jungle laboratories in Venezuela and Colombia, and was transferred to cargo ships to be brought to Europe via Costa Rica.
Approfittando delle ingentissime spedizioni di carichi di frutta tropicale dal Costa Rica.
Taking advantage of the massive shipments of tropical fruit coming from Costa Rica into Italy, they would bring cocaine in as well. The Due Mari investigation, closed by the Anti-Mafia Directorate of Reggio Calabria, executed by the GICO of Catanzaro and the specialist group GOA, shows how Costa Rica was the departure point of massive shipments of cocaine headed for Livorno. So the cocaine was hidden in with the tropical fruit.
Di cocaina che arrivavano a Livorno e quindi nella frutta tropicale veniva celata la cocaina stessa.
The ports of entry of the massive volume of cocaine in the Due Mari operation were Civitavecchia, close to Rome, and Livorno. The drugs were eventually to be sent to the port of Mestre, where the organization had a laboratory.
L''Ndrangheta è probabilmente il primo, grossista di cocaina.
The 'Ndrangheta is the world's largest wholesaler of cocaine. It has such strong ties that go back decades, many decades, and has such stable relations with the cartels. As I said before, the cartels that manage the transport of cocaine from South America.
L'invio dal Sud America della cocaina,
such as to be identified as the foremost criminal organization in this area, and has such good relations and offers such guarantees as not to have competitors.
Dedita a questo e conseguentemente ha dei rapporti talmente forti e offre delle garanzie tali da non avere concorrenti.
A new source of cocaine has entered the market with the rise of other forms of trafficking in Europe. Brazil.
L''Ndrangheta, qualora ritenga di poter sfruttare il porto.
If at any time the Ndrangheta thinks it can take advantage of any port in Brazil or a port of departure of cocaine in any other state, it has no trouble creating and stabilizing relationships, as it can draw on the fact that it is a respected organization.
Modificare dei rapporti perché può far sempre riferimento a quel suo essere una organizzazione rispettata.
However, Brazil is also host to a community that offers incalculable advantages in drug distribution. The Nigerian community in Sao Paulo offered the cocaine producers a back door to Europe. Over the last 5 years, West Africa has become a hub of cocaine smuggling, but not only.
What's interesting about Africa is that it's been uncharted territory for international law enforcement for some time. There's vast areas that are basically unpoliced. And a lot of parts of Africa, we don't know what's going on. But what we do know what's going on along the west coast and east coast of Africa, we're starting to see massive shipments of both heroin on the Macron coast, the east side of Africa, and cocaine on the western side of Africa. What drug trafficking typically does, it destabilizes a region. And drug traffickers look for destabilization in regions to move their drugs. What better area to go to than Africa?
Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria, Senegal are not only important places of departure of migrants, but also entry points and hubs for the drug trade.
DEA has always had a big interest in Nigerian trafficking organizations. Literally, there is a trafficking organization with Nigerian roots in every major city in the United States. Luckily, we have a great working relationship with our counterparts in Nigeria. We have a robust program, an international program with them. Why there is such a transnational presence as far as these Nigerian networks, who knows? But you're right, they have their prongs in every city across the world. These networks are set up and they're constantly moving, most of the time smaller amounts of drugs. You're not going to see Nigerian trafficking organizations moving tons of cocaine, but you're going to see Nigerian organizations moving 6 couriers on an airplane, each digested 1 kilogram of cocaine, for instance.
East Africa, too, has become a player in the drug trade, with a heroin trail that leads from Afghanistan through Kenya and across the continent.
Heroin coming through the Macron coast from Pakistan, it'll go into cities like Nairobi. There it can be carried via courier, via commercial air to different cities in Europe. Many times it will go via the water to other ports. Many times we have anecdotic information that there's drugs traffic, or there's heroin that's going across the continent via road to West Africa, where it's then swung up into Europe and sometimes the United States.
Recent seizures in Africa include shipments of heroin from Iran that were intercepted by the Australian Navy patrolling the Indian Ocean between Oman and Kenya under anti-terrorism Operation Manitou. In 2 years, the Australian Navy has confiscated and destroyed over 4 tons of heroin. In late 2016, British aristocrat Jack Marion was arrested on charges of importing 100 kilos of cocaine in bags of fertilizer to be delivered to a sugar business in Uganda. He denies the charges. However, over the last decade, Mombasa has become a hub for drug smuggling into Africa, according to the United Nations. Sometimes the routes being used for drug trafficking overlap with other profitable trades, such as arms and people smuggling, as well as other illegal activities, all being overseen by so-called super facilitators.
One thing that we've targeted recently, and actually this method started in Africa, is targeting what we call the super facilitators. These are people that can do various amounts of illegal activity, from arms sales to narcotic sales to human smuggling. They have their hands in all sorts of different crimes. DEA, along with our counterparts, have started to target these organizations, and by targeting the organizations, not only are we disrupting drug trafficking organizations, we're disrupting terrorist organizations that are operating pretty much with impunity all over the world.
What happens on the open ocean, in ships and boats crossing the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and the Mediterranean Sea, docking at European ports, is difficult to monitor. Even just tracking ships is hard, despite AIS technology. However, most of the trade is legal, and finding drug consignments is like hunting for a needle in a haystack. Undermining the profit of the traffickers seems to be the only way of combating the gangs. Fighting the Calabrian 'ndrangheta is a complex task, and, as with other criminal organizations, involves tracking down personal property and laundered investments.
Togliere ad un'organizzazione.
To take away a cocaine cargo from an organization causes damage, but alongside this, we also carry out what I believe is an ever more effective attack against illicit capital.
Contrasto ai patrimoni illeciti.
With the rise of the merciless 'ndrangheta across Germany and throughout Europe, and the cocaine cartels in Central and South America, the outlook for Europe's war against drugs is bleak.
In London, you know, there are a large number, and lots of other cities in Britain, there's large numbers of US-style street gangs who fight, you know, and use firearms to kill each other and protect their drug dealing operations. So that's a reality, and that's been going on since 2002, 2003, 2004. So we're kind of a decade or more on from that. But we haven't reached the levels of gang crime what's in the United States, and I don't know why, you know, but maybe that will happen.
However, by flooding Europe's market with cheap cocaine, the traffickers are undermining their own market, the same way they did in the United States.
Just recently, I viewed some statistics to where just back in 2014, a kilogram of cocaine in Central Europe would cost around $35,000 to $40,000. Now, today, 2016, it's down to $25,000 wholesale. Now, that's between if you're buying 10 and 100 kilograms of cocaine. But the prices are starting to go down. So the question is, what's the next market that's going to be flooded in Europe?
The ever-growing demand for drugs of every kind in Europe is feeding this deadly market. The middle-class populations of London, Amsterdam, Rome and Madrid are taking cocaine more than ever before, and the economic crisis seems not to have changed the market at all. The extent of the financial power of the drug barons is still largely unknown, but the efforts to combat the trafficking of their lethal cargo continues to be one of Europe's most pressing security concerns.